Mr. Main, Mr. Arscott, Mr. Azan, Dr. Bloomfield, Mr. Brown, Dr. Brownberg, Mr. Buchanan, Mr. Bunting, Dr. Campbell, Mr. Campbell, Mr. Clark, Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn, Ms. Daly, Mr. Daly, Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Golding, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hilton, Mr. Jackson, Mr. Kelly, Dr. McNeil, Ms. Nita, Mr. Paulwell, Mr. Phillips, Dr. Phillips, Mr. Pickersgill, Mr. Redman, Mr. Robertson, Mr. Robinson, Mr. Stewart, Reverend Thwaites, Mr. Dwayne Vaz, Mr. Wright.
Statements by ministers. Announcements.
Laid on the table of the House today are the following. Okay. Ministry Paper number 60 of 2018 and Government of Jamaica Audit Commission Annual Report for the year 2016-2017. Annual Performance Report of the Ministry of Labour and Social Security for the year 2017-2018. Ministry of Labour and Social Security studies on A, labor market trends and prospects for employment opportunities in Jamaica, Volume 2, and B, employment opportunities for low-skilled workers in Jamaica. Reform Agenda Report by the Labour Market Reform Commission. Annual Report of the National Land Agency, NLA, for the year 2017-2018. Financial statements of the Consolidated Fund for the year ending March 31, 2018. And the Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Foreign States, Kingdom of Belgium, Order 2018 under the Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Act.
Bills brought from the Senate. Petitions, papers, reports from committees. Notices of motions given orally.
Mr. Speaker,
Sure.
I beg to give notice that at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. The Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Act, whereas by virtue of Section 31(2) of the Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may, where any relevant treaty has been made with any foreign state by order, declare that the provisions of the Act shall apply in respect of such foreign state. And whereas Jamaica and the Kingdom of Belgium are parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption 2005 and the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime 2000, and whereas on the 8th day of June 2018, the Minister made the Mutual Assistance Criminal Matters Foreign States Kingdom of Belgium Order 2018, declaring that the provisions of the Act shall apply in respect of the Kingdom of Belgium, and whereas it is provided by Section 31(4) of the Act that an order made under that section shall be subject to affirmative resolution. Now, therefore, Be it resolved by the House of Representatives as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Mutual Assistance, Criminal Matters, Foreign States, Kingdom of Belgium, Order Resolution 2018. 2. The Mutual Assistance, Criminal Matters, Foreign States, Kingdom of Belgium, Order 2018, which was laid on the table of the House on the 19th day of June 2018, is hereby affirmed.
Questions and answers to questions. Motions that may be made at the commencement of public business requiring notice. Motions relating to the sittings of the House. Motions for leave to introduce bills. Presentation of bills without leave of the House first obtained. Public business. Minister Samuda.
Mr. Speaker, as you will recall, we indicated at the last sitting of the House that we would convene today for the sole purpose of debating a resolution dealing with the report on CARICOM that was prepared by a specially appointed committee led by former Prime Minister, Honorable Bruce Golding. It is intended that in order to arrive at a position that represents the situation as far as Jamaica is concerned, and using the information and the findings of the Commission, that debate would take place today. And it is intended to proceed on that basis. The Prime Minister will be bringing the resolution in short order. Yes, here. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that could you ask the Prime Minister? What? Delroy, Minister of Justice, you have a matter that you would like to take at this time?
Mr. Speaker, just ask for affirmation. Suspension of standing order for the resolution, which notice of which I gave earlier, can be taken now.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, may I ask that the House do affirm the resolution of which I gave notice? It is with respect to mutual agreement between the Kingdom of Belgium and ourselves.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of the resolution which the member refers to, and I believe it is only right that we get a copy, that we are aware of what it is that we are going to be discussing. We have no idea what it's discussing.
Let me help you. Let me help you, member. The fact of the matter is that the resolution is soon to be in the precincts of the Parliament. It has never been contemplated that we would be having a resolution brought before this Honourable House without giving to the opposition a copy of the resolution. You will, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the sitting be suspended for 5 minutes to give us an opportunity to present the resolution. All right, proceed with what you have. Proceed with what you have.
Mr. Speaker, this is a usual, straightforward affirmation where relations, mutual assistance is sought between two nations, and in this case, the Kingdom of Belgium. So in order to ensure the legality of the relations, we do, by positive affirmation, resolution in the House. We bring it to the House, and we ask the House for a affirmation of the resolution. So the resolution is basically that the treaty, which exists in law, that it comes into operation. And so in bringing this resolution is to ensure that we adopt it in this Parliament for the treaty to take effect.
Dr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, we are not yet at the point of debate. The issue is not to do at this point with the substance of any objection. The issue is to do with the procedure that is being followed. If we are to debate this, we at least need to know the context. We need to have the opportunity to examine it. In this instance, it is Belgium. It may be another state. It may be a state with whom we have to at least do our research and consultations among ourselves to examine the bona fides of such a state as to whether or not it is desirable. Our objection, Mr. Speaker, which we may not persist with, but our objection is that too often there is this breach of procedure which takes place in the House, and the House is being treated as a matter of convenience. The truth is, the only reason why it is being taken now, much to the perhaps embarrassment, if that is possible, of the Minister of Justice, is that the House leader is trying to kill time because a resolution which is needed for the House to be able to debate the CARICOM motion hasn't been brought here.
No, with due respect, that's not true. No, just a second.
Mr. Chuck.
Well, then, if that is so, then we don't need to debate it now. We can wait a week and do it next time.
The truth is that this should have been brought from last year. What happened is that it had to go through the process of check-in with the Attorney General's chambers, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It can go next week. The truth, what happened is that it was supposed to come last week, Mr. Speaker, but unfortunately I was not here last week, and I asked for it to be taken this week because it was ready 2 weeks ago, should have come last week, but I knew I was not going to be in the House last week. So I said I wanted to take it this week. So in fact, Mr. Speaker, when I saw that all that was on the order paper was for today was the debate, I said, this is a simple matter, please put it on. From yesterday, I called the clerk of the House and asked for it to be put on. So it's not a question we're filling in a gap.
Mr. Chuck.
Mr. Speaker, the member makes the situation worse and proves the point. If he knew 2 weeks ago a simple discussion with your opposition counterpart in this House would have enabled us to know, would have enabled us to ask any questions which we might have. For example, which countries in the European Union do we not currently have relations with? These relations, that is to say, a mutual legal assistance treaty arrangement. What are the reasons why we don't, if there is any such country? When will we have completed the list? There are all these issues which are relevant. The House can't be just treated willy-nilly. 2 weeks, you knew it was ready and not a discussion, and your first discussion is yesterday. that it has become a habit, Mr. Speaker, and it's a bad habit that we should rid ourselves of.
Members, if the opposition is not ready to proceed and we were asked by the leader of government business to hold a few minutes because there is a few minutes difficulty. I don't see a problem unless the opposition does not want to proceed on the matter, and they have a right since you did not advise them. But may I ask you again, if you object to the procedure, then we will have a short adjournment and await the we'll have a short suspension and await the arrival of the Prime Minister on the matter which you were informed earlier. Let me ask you again, Dr. Phillips, if you, on what has been presented to you, Mr. Golden, Mr. Gold, oh, yes. We understand your presentation, Dr. Phillips.
In this house, yes. Mr. Golding, the member from South St. Andrew, is the person who deals with justice matters, and he has indicated that he would like to have a conversation.
So he can proceed?
So, no. Prior to proceeding, he wants to have a conversation. So we ought not to proceed. I accept your proposal that we suspend the sitting to enable the government side to be ready with the other debate.
We are going to suspend for Mr. Golden to have a discussion with Mr. Chuck. The House is suspended for 10 minutes.
Living life in peace. Ooh. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
Imagine better parenting for children.
Imagine better education for children.
Imagine more inclusion for children with disabilities.
Imagine no child being abused in any way.
Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man.
Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one.
I hope someday you will join us, and the world will live as one.
Reimagine a better future for children.
Watch out for this. Watch out for this. Watch out for this. Watch out for this.
You're watching PBCJ, the People's Station. me have to protect him. That's why I put a code in the cable box so him can't access any adult or X-rated channel. It's me choose to put the cable in the house, and choice come with responsibility.
Broadcasting Commission. More choices, better access, and higher quality.
Start your day with some encouragement from New York Times best-selling author and practical Bible teacher Joyce Meyer.
God is not mad if we've not arrived. He's just happy that you're here today wanting to learn more.
You'll be refreshed and strengthened as you hear powerful messages of hope and transformation.
God, I want you to lead me and guide me, and I'm going to do what you want me to do. I don't care what it costs.
Persons who work around smokers breathe in poisons such as cyanide, arsenic, and carbon monoxide. Cigarette smoke eats away at nearly every vital organ and tissue of the body, the heart, the lung, even the brain. Exposure to secondhand smoke is eating you alive.
Smoke-free public places. It's your right. Protect it.
Nicky baby, come here. You understand, so I have to send you guy your auntie so you can go school and turn out better than me.
When I go be my time.
Picnic, come finish your work.
If you or anyone you know has been a victim of human trafficking, call 811 or 1-888-PROTECT. Be wise. Open your eyes. Spot them. Stop them. A message brought to you by the National Task Force Against Trafficking in Persons.
The rape of a 12-year-old girl is being investigated. The crime scene team is traveling to the forensic lab where the evidence will be tested. Welcome to an episode of Security Matters, the program that takes you behind the scenes of strategic departments of the Ministry of National Security to show the dedicated teams working hard to make Jamaica safer. Earlier, a rape kit and clothing from a rape scene involving a 12-year-old girl were brought in. Dr. Judith Mott, director of the Forensic Institute, explains how the evidence is processed.
In the case of a sexual assault, we would process the evidence. We would look for biological fluids, namely blood and semen, and other trace evidence like hairs and fibers.
We are testing for the presence of semen. It's moistened to lift the stain. And if semen is present, the color will change to a purple coloration.
If it is that we find the biological fluid, we then submit those for DNA analysis, and the samples would be collected and submitted to our DNA unit, who would then subject them to DNA analysis.
When we do have to test for the presence of saliva, depending on the nature of the offense, there's a simple test, it's called the Fadibas test, where the moistened piece of paper, blue, is applied to the swab, and within 45 minutes, it dissolves the globules that are on the paper. It dissolves it, and then we know that, yes, this is saliva. And again, we can do DNA analysis. Here we're testing for the presence of blood. This is a presumptive test because there are other things that are brown in coloration. So there's a particular test that we apply. Again, it's chemical in nature, and it's a color. It gives a color change from colorless to pink within seconds.
Those in favor? Those against? As have it. Prime Minister.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice that at the meeting of the House, at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following motion. Whereas the government of Jamaica determined that it was necessary to conduct a comprehensive evaluation on the effectiveness of Jamaica's membership in the Caribbean Community CARICOM and the ACP CARIFORUM framework, and whereas it is timely for Jamaica to determine the impact of these regional arrangements on Jamaica's economic growth and development, with particular reference to trade in goods and services, investment promotion, international competitiveness, employment, and security. And whereas the government of Jamaica established a commission in July 2016 with the mandate to conduct an in-depth examination of those aspects of Jamaica's existing regional relationships that may not be fully meeting their intended objectives, and whereas this required an assessment of CARICOM's performance against the goals and objectives enunciated in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, and an identification of the challenges in advancing the regional integration process, and whereas the commission established by the government of Jamaica was chaired by Mr. Bruce Golding, former Prime Minister, who was assisted by 18 distinguished commission members. And whereas the final commission report containing its findings and recommendations was delivered to the Prime Minister of Jamaica, the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, on December the 31st, 2017, and whereas the final commission report was tabled in the House of Representatives on February the 6th, 2018, to allow for its consideration and debate to seek consensus on Jamaica's future engagement in the region. And whereas Jamaica will assume the chair of CARICOM in July 2018, now, therefore, be it resolved by the House of Representatives as follows. 1. The movement towards greater regional integration and cooperation within CARICOM remains relevant, important, and strategic to Jamaica. 2. It is essential for CARICOM to focus primarily on the gains that can be achieved through the single market, in view of the fact that issues related to sovereignty and supranationality continue to play a part in impeding progress towards a single economy. 3. All member states must make a clear and definitive commitment to establish the CARICOM single market with a specific, time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action to fulfill obligations. A period of 5 years should be proposed to meet objectives under a program of action for full implementation of the single market, taking into account the CARICOM Secretariat's implementation plan, as well as the capacity of individual member states to meet the requirements. The governance dilemma, 5, within CARICOM and CARICOM institutions must be effectively addressed and a performance-based, results-based approach adopted. The rules-based system, 6, that holds CARICOM and its member states accountable to the peoples of the region must be strengthened to ensure compliance and facilitate dispute settlement in accordance with the Treaty of Chaguaramas. Greater prominence should be assigned to the role of the private sector, 7, in supporting the CSM objectives, as well as in monitoring member states' compliance and implementation of the CSM. 8, Jamaica shall require a review of the basis for assessment of the member states' financial contribution to CARICOM and regional institutions, as well as a rationalization of existing bodies. 9, CARICOM should seek to broaden its economic cooperation with neighboring states including those which comprise CARIFORUM, and seek, where possible, to take advantage of the CARIFORUM construct to negotiate future trade agreements with third parties. And 10, Jamaica will further evaluate its terms of engagements with CARICOM if stated and agreed commitments towards advancing the CSM are not implemented by all member states within the agreed time frame. Mr. Speaker, I beg to give further notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take this motion. Public business.
Mr. Speaker, today is a historic day because this resolution that has just been read by the Prime Minister and the debate that will follow is going to have a severe impact on the way forward. Its introduction to the debate.
Well, you're asking the Speaker to declare that we are at public business.
Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, it is a very important day for us, and I therefore invite you to allow us to go directly to public business to enable the Prime Minister to open the debate.
Mr. Speaker, for such an important resolution, I think that we should at least, all of us should at least have a copy so that we can digest the information.
Yeah, it can be circulated.
He has a copy. Sit down.
Prime Minister, they're asking for a copy of the resolution.
Yes, he has a copy, but he can't read it anyhow.
That's not nice.
Mr. Speaker, I was asked by the acting leader of opposition business to indicate the list of speakers that will be making presentations today. And I think it is important that we are all advised of this. The order of speaking will be as follows, and I ask each member who will make a presentation to just take note of it. The Prime Minister will open the debate. Next, the Leader of the Opposition will make his presentation. Next, the Attorney General will speak. Then the Opposition Spokesman on Foreign Affairs, the member from Southeast St. Anne, followed by the Minister of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries, who will be followed by the member from Central Manchester, who will be then followed by the Minister of Tourism, and after that, the member from Western St. Andrew, and the member from West Central St. Catherine and Minister of Health, and finally the opposition spokesman on foreign affairs, on housing and Highgate and everything else. And then the debate will be closed by the Prime Minister. Just keep note of that and speak in that sequence. Thank you very much.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favor? Those against? As a Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there has been much debate in the public domain about CARICOM. Some of the information and the debate in the public domain has not always benefited from a studied view of the issues that surround Jamaica's participation in CARICOM. And speaking, Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister of the country, but also leader of a political party, the expressions that have come sometimes would seek to indicate that there is some reluctance on this side to fully participate in CARICOM. By this debate, Mr. Speaker, I wish to put pay to such thought that there is no reluctance on this side to participate in CARICOM. What we have always maintained is that our participation in whatever regional organization must make sense for Jamaica. And we have also maintained that a weak Jamaica does not make a strong CARICOM. And we acknowledge Jamaica's important leadership role in building and strengthening and sustaining the institution of CARICOM. We assembled a team of eminent persons to review Jamaica's participation in CARICOM and advise the government so that we can take a studied approach to the issues of CARICOM. You will recall that in 2016, 2017, there was great concern regarding issues of free movement of persons within the region. You would recall that there was concern in our business community that there are unfair trade practices, particularly to do with the subsidizing of oil. And those, Mr. Speaker, those concerns rose to the level where it prompted me to assemble this very eminent group of Jamaicans to study the issue and advise the government. I want to thank former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, who chaired the committee, which was comprised of then Ambassador Dr. Nigel Clark, Dr. Damian King, Mr. Christopher Levy, Mr. Metrosiaga, Mrs. Michelle Chung, Mr. Warren McDonnell, Mrs. Maxine Henry Wilson, Professor Eleanor Brown, Mr. Michael Diamond, Mr. Dennis Cohen, Mr. John Jackson, Mr. Kevin O'Brien Chang, Mr. William Mafood, Ambassador Lauren McDonough, Mr. Donny Bunting, and Mr. Hugh Johnson. Mr. P.B. Scott eventually replaced Mr. William Mafood, who sat in the capacity as president of the PSOJ. I want to publicly thank them. Done. And I'm sure the entire House will agree that this is a very well researched, very well put together report. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the Commission consulted very widely, and in fact, consulted many prime ministers across the region and business leaders and other stakeholders. So I have great confidence in the report, and I believe that it is a good tool in directing and helping government to chart a policy towards CARICOM. Mr. Speaker, though we are the government, when it comes to dealing with regional policy, and when you want to ensure that there is sustainability in your policy. It is important that we bring these matters of such national importance to the floor of Parliament to allow for debate. Because, Mr. Speaker, we wouldn't want there to be, God forbid, a change in administration and then there is a change in policy. There was no change in our policy. But it is important that for a policy like this, that there is continuity, that the community itself can look on Jamaica and rely on its position regardless of which administration is in power. So I thought, Mr. Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition agreed that we should have this national debate in Parliament. So, Mr. Speaker, I propose to very quickly go through the government's position on the 32 recommendations made in the report. Let me say from the outset that the government has not accepted all the recommendations en bloc. There are some that we can agree with, some that we may have to say, let's consider this for the future, and there may be some that we would have to examine more closely before we say we could implement. And I suspect that that may be the same approach taken by the opposition. Mr. Speaker, we can all agree that the report is timely and that it represents a significant milestone in the ongoing dialogue across the region on whether the integration movement is indeed serving the interests of our nationals and member states. I believe that the work can be regarded as focused and informative, and that it will become an integral part of the historical record available to the people of the region. You would have noted that the report has 33 recommendations which boldly project a way forward in addressing aspects of our regional relationships that are not fully meeting their intended objectives. They also include approaches which could forge strategic partnerships with other CARIFORUM states in the Northern Caribbean to buttress the government's measures to economic growth. Mr. Speaker, our extensive review of the report has identified recommendations at various stages of readiness for implementation, including some that may not be within our reach at this time for various reasons. The recommendations fall into three categories. Those recommendations that present themselves as readily implementable in the short to medium term, utilizing existing resources and capitalizing on the community's ongoing reform process. Other recommendations that are feasible, but which will require significant institutional and legal adjustments, including amendments of the revised Treaty of Chagarans. And yet another set of recommendations, while ought to be pursued, but which are likely to be extraordinary in their requirement for collective political will. Turning first to some of the recommendations that have the greatest potential for implementation in the short to medium term, I will begin with matters of governance, including performance management, financial management, development financing, institutional framework, and relations, economic relations. Performance oversight. Recommendation 17 calls for all institutions and agencies to be subjected to a performance evaluation every 3 years. The report, which should be, and the reports, Mr. Speaker, should be made public. This would promote meaningful reordering of activities and emphasize the delivery of results. Jamaica fully supports the recommendation in the context of the government's commitment to the principles of transparency and accountability. Of the Secretariat, office has proven vital to the sustainment. In like manner, the Eminent Persons Group of ASEAN, which comprises highly distinguished and well-respected citizens from the ASEAN member countries, are meant to examine the group's cooperation activities, undertake thorough reviews of the existing institutional framework, and propose appropriate improvements if so required. However, while the government embraces the spirit of the recommendation, we do recognize that they hinge on the creation of another institution with attendant budgetary implications, and that is inconsistent with the goal of streamlining the operations of the organization. Mr. Speaker, we may want to consider, instead of establishing new institutions for oversight, we could very well have the existing oversight bodies in member countries. Most of our countries would have an Auditor General, for example, to examine the government's commitments to CARICOM and report to the public, which would effectively also be reporting to the CARICOM region on the government's performance. That may be, Mr. Speaker, one way in which we can increase oversight. Perhaps, however, Mr. Speaker, the more feasible option would be to utilize and empower the existing CARICOM Committee of Ambassadors, and there is such a Committee of Ambassadors, which we would probably want to now form as our own group of eminent persons, as a means of providing the oversight needed. I could immediately think, Mr. Speaker, of utilizing the former prime ministers in the region, who would immediately already have good relations. They would know each other. They would probably, some of them have connections to the existing administration and would have been elevated out of the political realm into the realm of statesmen and women, and could very well use their eminent person status to encourage governments to keep their fulfill their agreements and commitments. Another recommendation, Mr. Speaker, which focuses on institutional governance is recommendation 16, which speaks to the mandatory streamlining of results-based management principles and calls for the submission of annual reports and audited financial statements to heads of government. The recommendation also calls for the publication of the status of member states' contributions. Mr. Speaker, that is now not currently done and would add a new dimension of transparency and indeed oversight to the activities of the various institutions of CARICOM, which, Mr. Speaker, do come at a cost. They are not light on the budget of Jamaica. As regards results-based management, we are pleased to note that the implementation is already underway in the community. And we recall that at the 35th meeting of the Conference of Heads of Government held in Antigua and Barbuda in 2014, approved the community's 5-year strategic plan, which commits the Secretariat to establish a planning, monitoring, and evaluation and reporting system that is based on the principles of results-based management and is in response to the need to target a narrow range of specified outcomes within specified timeframes in relation to the regional development agenda. Mr. Speaker, in terms of issues related to financial management, in keeping with Recommendation 12, the government is committed to providing the CARICOM Secretariat with the necessary resources to conduct its work. I am pleased to note that Jamaica has been commended in recent times for keeping pace with our contributions in spite of the harsh economic and financial realities. And I commend the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade for the strenuous efforts it has made in that regard over the last year. We therefore support the Commission's proposal for greater incentives or stricter enforcement of sanctions to promote liquidation of member states' subscription arrears. As the second largest contributor to CARICOM, Jamaica has taken careful note of the scale of assessed contributions for which we are currently obliged to pay 23.15% of the budget of CARICOM. Jamaica has long advocated for the basic principle that each member state of CARICOM should pay its contributions according to its capacity to pay. And as such, we will continue to call for a contributions methodology that better reflects each member state's capacity to pay in an equitable manner based on the most current and comparable data available. In that regard, we fully support recommendation number 12 in relation to sharing financial obligations on an equitable basis, taking account of variables such as levels of indebtedness. We are well aware that good financial management depends not only on the predictability of funding, it relies also on the standards applied to the allocation and disbursement of funds. Undoubtedly, CARICOM must strive to spend more wisely, more responsibly, in accordance with agreed budget levels. In that regard, we welcome the considered proposal of the Commission in recommendation number 7, which would make it mandatory for the Secretary General, in accordance with Article 27(5) of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, to provide technical assessments, including cost implementations, prior to the taking of decisions by the heads of government. We should no longer be expected to adopt initiatives or strategies without the benefit of the transparency provided by the presentation of a thorough analysis of associated costs. Mr. Speaker, some recommendations focused on financing for development. A crucial matter for Jamaica and all CARICOM member states, given our unique structural characteristics, our unsustainable debt burdens, and high levels of vulnerability to exogenous economic and environmental shocks. In this vein, recommendation 10 calls for Jamaica's commitment to the second funding cycle of the Caribbean Development Fund. Now, you will recall that CARICOM middle developing countries, the MDCs, or we say more developed countries, including Jamaica, had opted out of benefiting from the country assistance program of the Caribbean Development Fund until the second funding cycle, and that despite our struggles to meet the objectives of our commitment of US 19.69 million under the first funding cycle of the Caribbean Development Fund, we completed payment of our arrears in 2017. I remember this, Mr. Speaker, because in our last term as government, many appeals were made to us to make payments. And even during those difficult times, we still made our attempts. My recollection is that the previous administration also made some attempts to pay. I don't know how much we actually paid. But, Mr. Speaker, in 2017, in May, we completed our obligation to this $19.69 million to the Caribbean Development Fund. Just to reinforce the point, Mr. Speaker, the agreement within CARICOM was that the MDCs, the middle developing countries or the more developed countries, would not seek to benefit from that cycle of funding. So they would contribute, but they would not seek to benefit. They would not send in project applications. They would allow the lesser developed countries to be fully, to get the full benefit. But then the second cycle, Mr. Speaker, countries would participate. Mr. Speaker, but that would also mean that we would have to contribute. Jamaica opted, Mr. Speaker, not to contribute and not to ask for or apply for any benefits, any loans, any development assistance from the second funding cycle. Mr. Speaker, the recommendation is that we should participate. But at this time, Mr. Speaker, I think we will have to be frank in saying that it would not be beneficial because the funding cycle has already gone several years. We would only have 2 years. And it is quite likely, Mr. Speaker, that we would not be able to benefit with the time remaining on the second funding cycle. So, Mr. Speaker, with this recommendation for us to participate, we do not, at this time, agree. Mr. Speaker, in reviewing the international framework, the Commission conducted an extensive examination of community institutions and agencies, which I understand was no easy feat, given the number of institutions and their locations. Ultimately, the Commission recommended a review and rationalization of these institutions and agencies with a view to reducing cost, eliminating overlaps, and improving service delivery. I recall that in that regard, the heads of government have repeatedly called for such a review and rationalization to ensure that they remain fit for purpose and contribute to the creation of an enabling environment for coordinated management across the regional integration architecture. It is noteworthy that the Commission's report has underscored that imperative. We acknowledge that annual meetings are held between the Secretary General and the heads of CARICOM institutions and associate institutions, and that these meetings are geared towards promoting coordination and complementarity in the services offered. We also acknowledge that rationalization of community institutions is a part of the governance priority of the community's 5-year strategic plan 2015 to 2019. However, in spite of the annual meetings between the Secretary General and institutions and the strategic plan, there are prevailing inefficiencies and overlaps. We believe, therefore, that there is still significant room for CARICOM's operations, for improving CARICOM's operations through a rationalization process and the adoption of approaches aimed at further savings and efficiency. Mr. Speaker, with respect to recommendation 26, which speaks to foreign policy coordination and consultation, there is already in place comprehensive procedures to facilitate consultation and coordination of foreign policy issues under the ambit of the Council of Foreign and Community Relations, COFCO. A review of these procedures, though beneficial, would never guarantee the complete avoidance of varying positions. Positions recently taken by CARICOM countries on various regional and international issues have been a clear reminder of the fact that foreign policy coordination should not be equated with foreign policy harmonization. It would be difficult to avoid differences in foreign policy positions in a regional forum like CARICOM, as they are demonstrative of the divergence of national sovereign interests. I wish to emphasize that point, Mr. Speaker. When we talk about CARICOM, we speak with a certain sense of, a romantic sense of a group working in harmony, operating as one bloc, as if we had a political union. That is not the case, Mr. Speaker. We do try to coordinate our foreign policy, but it is rare, well, not rare, but it is not always the case that you will have harmony in foreign policy. And I think that this is something that we have to accept as just the nature of the regional architecture that we have, that though in our minds we would like to think of the foreign policy as one cohesive, harmonious outlook, that is not the case. Mr. Speaker, the Commission's report recommends that Jamaica seeks clear, definitive commitment from all member states to a specific, time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action to fulfill all its obligations and complete other requirements for the CSME to be fully established and operational within the next 5 years. It is worth recalling that heads of government approved an implementation plan in July 2017, 10 years ago, which mandates member states to implement their outstanding actions on the CSM within 4 years. Now, the CSME is the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, and the CSM is the CARICOM Single Market. Slight distinction that the economy requires the coordination of monetary policy and fiscal policy, whereas the market requires most of the harmonization of trade-related policies and institutions that support the market. That's a slight distinction in the terminologies used. So CSME would have been in 5 years, and CSM would be in 4 years. This time frame is notably less than what the Commission has recommended. The implementation plan, I should note, failed to address the single economy. So within this context, the Commission compels us to take the bold move towards addressing the elephant in the room. The Commission is to be commended for the guidance it has provided with respect to feasible options available to Jamaica and other member states regarding the matter of implementation of the CSME and trade engagements. Relating to the CSME, the harmonization of laws and regulations governing the registration and operation of businesses, the removal of restrictions on the provision of services, the removal of restrictions on the right of establishment, including ownership of land, You would note, Mr. Speaker, that in some CARICOM member territories, you can't just go there and buy land. So there are specific laws which prohibit non-residents, non-citizens from owning land. And there are other requirements, of course, which make it mandatory that if you're going to open a business, you have to have a local participating with a certain percentage. And, you know, these may very well work even within our own country. There would be persons who would agree with that thought. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, our economy and our economic policy, on either side of the political divide, we have never sought to have that kind of limitation placed on our economy. But these are the requirements of some of our countries, which pose a restriction, a possible restriction on countries like Jamaica in doing business within CARICOM. Some of the other things, Mr. Speaker, that we should pursue, and we have had agreement internally, would be the modernization and harmonization of intellectual property legislation and the adoption of conventions relating to the registration and administration of patents, trademarks, etc. Recommendation 1.3 relating to integrated capital markets. We believe that an agreed protocol for cross-border regulatory cooperation is essential to any custom union. In this regard, we support the view that this recommendation is attainable within the next 3 years. However, we are also mindful that many member states are currently at various stages of reform to bring their regulatory landscape in line with institutional standards. Consequently, Mr. Speaker, there may be need to apply some flexibility with respect to the timeline for full implementation by all member states. In this matter, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make a point. The harmonization of legislation throughout the region to deal with the movement of capital and the reporting on taxation issues is happening even outside of the requirement of CARICOM. The truth is, a process, Mr. Speaker, whether or not CARICOM heads would be willing to look at what we are already, I hate to use the term, forced to comply with, but what we are already complying with, and seek to get greater alignment for the benefit of CARICOM. And so it's happening, but not being directed by the region. And I think the region could collectively bring to bear some level of harmony in both taxation policy beneficial for us. So I just wanted to make that point there. Yes. Turn attention to the recommendations relating to the right of establishment set out at recommendations 1.18. States participating in the CSME have an obligation to remove restrictions on the right of establishment and the right to provide services across the region. In relation to the right of establishment, all member states are to pass the requisite regulatory and supervisory staff. Jamaica is also assessing its implementation of the regime to ensure that no further restriction exists. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, we would probably be the most advanced country in CARICOM in complying with the free movement of. 1.2 on the full free, consistent with the ruling of the C, clearly established some benchmarks for what is to be achieved. It will now be a matter for the organs and bodies of CARICOM in your time period. Further, it is recommended that in addition to security and public health considerations, which are in keeping with Articles 225 and 226 respectively of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, that a further exception to free movement mentions the grounds public funds. This would be consistent with the 2007 conference decision, which was taken into account in the Shani Myrie case. Jamaica's position is that there should be only 3 exceptions to the free movement of persons. Health duration, because there are small countries that the movement of individuals should not become a burden on the public purse of the country in which they are going. And I think that is a reasonable position with respect to the applicability of the exceptions, so as not to potentially erode the right to free movement or lead to unnecessary litigation processes, where that right is in fact properly underscore that the right to free movement requires persons seeking to move within the CSME region to enter through properly appointed entry so as not to be removed for reasons of violation of said terms. The report also proposes the establishment of an agreed framework in relation to the operations of the citizenship by investment programs, which are growing and popular states of CARICOM. This would include appropriate protocols and safeguards regarding the terms, conditions by investment programs. Just to be clear, Mr. Speaker, so that we understand that many persons would know what these programs are, there are countries that set up a framework in which a foreign national could apply by virtue of apply for citizenship by virtue of meeting some minimum threshold of investment. Once that investment is made, then citizenship to the full benefits of the country. Some members have expressed concerns about the program. There is a fear that persons from their citizens are fleeing or listed as terrorists could find their way into the Caribbean, and gaining access to one country would give them access to all countries by virtue of having. To be fair, countries with CIP programs have stressed that they go through rigorous checks. They check with their counterparts in the United States, in the UK, in the European Union, meet the highest standards, and that they are on no watch lists or are in any way blacklisted. However, you know, it just takes one misstep and the entire region to be an agreed protocol and framework around the citizenship by investment programs. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to make it clear that there are some persons who have raised with me that Jamaica at some point in time contemplated a citizenship by investment program. I'm not aware of that, Mr. Was an economic residency program which would place any foreign national seeking to gain Jamaican citizenship on a pathway by virtue of award of citizenship. So they would have to come to Jamaica, they would have to make their investments, we would have to have an opportunity to assess them, and they would have to go through. That, Mr. Speaker, is still under consideration. The government has not put it on a priority list of things to be done, but it is still under consideration. And, Mr. Speaker, once we have a framework agreed within CARICOM about how we treat with these programs, then we would, Mr. Speaker, seek to. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that we have taken the time to ensure CIP programs in other countries that the systems are in place to ensure that there is no threat to Jamaica from those persons who have benefited.
Prime Minister, could you hold me seek to the House a resolution?
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the Prime Minister be allowed sufficient time to allow him to complete his presentation.
Those in favour?
I promise that I will spare you the sufficient time to finish, because this is indeed an extensive report, and I may not need to go through every single recommendation. Date the House on the ones that I consider to be of great importance. Mr. Speaker, let me now address trade agreements, which might be a little bit more challenging to accomplish within a controversial issue, is the removal of all non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, here is where we really have contention in CARICOM. CARICOM has done considerable work, a myriad of harmonization protocols and policies to minimize obstacles to trade in this area. These include the establishment of various regulatory mechanisms, namely the Caribbean Agriculture, Health and Food Safety Agency, and the existence of these mechanisms as well from outside the CSME once they're of entry. This matter is sensitive and has implications for revenue collection by member states, since in such a scenario, the port of final destination would not be the port of entry and charges. Now, Mr. Speaker, a common market and a single economy, then it doesn't really matter which port the goods enter, because we're all part of one market, and we have a standardized set of duties. But, Mr. Speaker, because it might be easier for a shipping company to land goods in Jamaica destined for Trinidad, or where logistics, yes. But, Mr. Speaker, because there might be beneficial to do it now, but it would certainly, Mr. Speaker, improve business within the region. But, as I said, these are some of the difficult trade issues that we have to deal with. Major issue of contention involves the rules of origin criteria. Among the questions still being debated in relation to extra-regional importation of raw materials to make a final free circulation. And two, what are the additional measures that will be implemented to ensure the rules of origin criteria are effectively monitored? Mr. Speaker, recommendation 28 urges CARICOM to conduct as far as possible through CARIFORUM. While it is generally agreed that negotiating through CARICOM would offer greater leverage and would facilitate a stronger negotiating position, it would be imperative that CARICOM, if it is to gain any tangible benefits from this option, this could prove to be an extremely complex process. It will be recalled that the CARIFORUM framework, comprising CARICOM plus Cuba and the Dominican Republic, between the ACP and the EU, in order to apply this functional group arrangement in other spheres, CARICOM's existing trade arrangements with Cuba and the Dominican Republic would necessarily have. Said this, however, I should indicate that an interesting process is currently emerging whereby CARICOM and the Dominican Republic are examining modalities for concluding a trade agreement with the UK in a post-Brexit scenario, economic partnership agreement provisions. It remains to be seen whether this kind of collaborative process beyond CARICOM could be extended to other future trading arrangements at the regional and multilateral level. And phytosanitary standards and procedures set out as at recommendation 1.7, CARICOM has already taken steps in that regard, Positive developments include the establishment of the Caribbean Agricultural Health and Food Safety Agency, an effective and efficient regional sanitary and phytosanitary regime, and to also execute on behalf of member states such actions and activities that are more effectively and efficiently executed. Recommendations relating to harmonization of laws and regulations governing the registration and operations of businesses and standards of incorporation requirements. The community is making strides in these areas, which will ultimately facilitate a more enabling and urgently requires timely attention by heads of government. With reference to online company registry, the current approach does not facilitate a single registration system per se, but to provide a mechanism for the public to, among other things, conduct searches contained in the 13 company registries. CARICOM has also established the CARICOM regional standards in keeping with the relevant international code of good practice for standards development. However, in spite of the progress made to date, there is much more work to be done to ensure complementarity of standards and procedures. On Plan 2017, most member states have enacted the necessary legislation and are to introduce a registrar of service providers, a national, the prescribed certificate of recognition, and the prescribed procedures for application and issuance of the certificate of recognition. Jamaica has a strong interest in the services regime and would like to see it fully operational as soon as possible. Mr. Speaker, turning to the issue of fair competition and consumer protection. The Fair Trading Commission and the recommendations, particularly those relating to fair competition within the 5-year period. Already, Jamaica is compliant with its obligation by virtue of our Fair Competition Act of 1993, which was amended with competition and consumer protection legislation, includes Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana. Over the years, the FTC has been is to examine the jurisdictional, legal, and financial implications of having national competition authorities established in all member states, together with the required support system. For the removal of restrictions preventing suppliers of goods and services from qualifying for government contracts in member states. This will contribute to an enhanced scope for procurement opportunities in member states. Thankfully, transparent and equitable public procurement regime across the region, in keeping with the commitments outlined in Article 239 of the essential element. Mr. Speaker, I want to address in greater depth the issues affecting the decisions posited by the Commission in Recommendation 9 is the elimination of the differentiation between the more developed countries, the MDCs, and the less developed countries, the LDCs in CARICOM, while retaining the provision in the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas for special treatment of disadvantaged countries, regions, and sectors. The merit of the Commission's proposals lays in the fact that there are no stated and clearly defined criteria institutions. Well, if you look at the traditional classification of, and then you look at their per capita ranking, you would see that many of them, in fact, I believe all of them now, rank above Jamaica. Criteria that was applied, the taxonomy that was applied 30, 40 years ago, definitely needs to be revisited, reviewed, and I think personally abandoned now. Recommendation 23 calls in the community. through the establishment of a central dispute settlement body. This is an attempt to imitate the structure of the WTO dispute settlement understanding. This recommendation, however, has perhaps not accounted for the purpose of dispute resolution. Dispute resolution in trade. The establishment of existing institutions and mandates. Has been the issue of the difference in the cost of energy across the region, based largely on the application of subsidies. With respect to recommendation 25, for CARICOM to approach the CCJ for a final determination about whether violation of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Of a request for an advisory opinion. Also, the subject matter within the European Union context, 17. And we that their government has made certain moves to take off any Jamaican businesses, but pursued by Jamaica, including the upgrade of our refinery, moving to greater renewable energy, will in fact lessen the impact and dependence is not resolved. Of the other 18 distinguished members of the Commission, with our economic growth. Work that it has undertaken, not only as the Secretariat to the Commission, but also in facilitating various analyses of the findings of the report. The entire region has awaited the government's final. I think it only appropriate that they be granted the requisite bipartisan consideration, so that they may be duly shared with my CARICOM colleagues for discussion. I thank you, and I look forward to constructive input. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Peter Phillips.
Provides one of the few opportunities really afforded to us all in this House to harmonize aspect of our has been an extending throughout the entire period of of a regional federation was not to succeed. 4 years after independence, in fact, during an administration drawn in the first instance, which then evolved into the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, as we now have it, during an administration drawn from this side. And subsequently, there have been successive revisions, was revived, and which evolved into the proposals for the single market and economy. That, I think, in recent times, as has been mentioned, there has been a growing feeling in certain sections of the community, and one might add with good reason, that there were a number of concerns which have been mentioned, some of particularly high profile, as in the case of Shanique Myrie, where it was felt that the promise of free movement that was implied by the single market and economy was not being fulfilled. Subsequently, who were denied entry, and they felt improperly denied entry to Trinidad and Tobago in 2016, Alongside that, there were the complaints, I think, while there was not a, least in part, the establishment of this commission. Certainly it is in that context that the commission was established to review Jamaica's relations with CARICOM and the CARIC Forum frameworks. Former Prime Minister, the Honorable Bruce Golding. We join with the Prime Minister on this side in expressing our appreciation to the members of the Commission, some of whom are well known to us, who participated in this. Truly, it was not only an extensive and representative national effort, but it also undertook widespread consultations, not only within Jamaica, of the report itself and the government recommendations. I am going to take the position that we are, in effect, for one thing, we haven't had a time really to reflect on the government's position as I approach the report. It's not a matter of that should cause great conflict. Essentially, but their recommendations and exclude some. The question, nevertheless, does remain, what is the, if implemented, will fundamentally transform the experience of CARICOM and make it a more efficient and representative institution. I don't think that, given what presented by the Prime Minister, essential critical minimum, which will enable us to achieve our objectives of, to that extent, I think that what we will obviously need is further of this report. I think it represents an important proposes that it becomes a government of CARICOM to embrace the need to move forward and to review other aspects of the CARICOM. The Golding Report in its executive summary and the CSME. Highlight some of what those at the same time are absolutely critical. CARICOM. The central analysis provided there is an implementation deficit in CARICOM. And I don't think there's anybody who has experienced CARICOM over the many, many decades. I would say this implementation deficit. Now, some of the been around as explanatory factors, some of the explanations as to why this implementation deficit have been around with us from some time, from the 90s. And indeed some even before that, concerning the whole question, for example, of the unanimity rule in CARICOM, because it has become a block to the implementation of any far-reaching recommendation. Now, nevertheless, the difficulty of changing it does not minimize the necessity, in my view, of at least making an attempt to secure some changes. And in the report, there is at least it is possible to separate out some which may not be subject to the unanimity warranted. Equally, there are in fact penalties that are performance in relation to the decisions taken at the highest level of CARICOM, heads of government, and by the other organs. Then we are going to have a repetition and then go away and forget about the commitments given. And you know, Einstein is said to have defined madmal meetings and then make no further contribution to the performance, whether financial or in human resource terms, or otherwise, to implement those decisions, then we'll continue in that way. So it would suggest, A, that we should make explicit provision in the CARICOM Treaty, community law, as well as decisions of the heads of government that require executive action within a time worthy of support, specifically, and that further, there should be established in the treaty a body of sanctions for willful non-compliance of. It sets out some of those possible sanctions, including the right to vote on particular decisions of the conference against another member state, and there may be others, including monetary fines that can be imposed on states who willfully ignore the decisions of heads of government. I think that there is also particular is to state that the distinction of countries which are in per capita terms, like Jamaica, I frankly willfully ignore their effects, may have particular development challenges need to be taken into that need to be detailed. I think there's scope, there's a lot of duplication of inefficiencies, and I don't think any of the institutions, including this assessment as to the utilization of these scarce resources made available to them and whether they are being optimally used. We don't need that. We have to continue doing things in the way that we have been doing them. And the amount of money spent simply traveling from country to country for those don't take place. We don't. I believe that we need to place particular emphasis, and here I agree with the thrust of this, including the free movement of people, with the reservations in relation to security, public health that are outlined. I think we certainly would await to see citizenship by investment. Suffice it to say that in the countries in the region where that is practiced, it's essential for it. And I think we have to recognize even perhaps the most treasured thing all of us, Jamaica, and it's not to be traded, given out lightly, earned by the sweat, blood, tears of many generations. But at the same time, even as we say that, let us remind ourselves that we need to continue to give it meaning, and most of all, by enforcing standards of good governance and the operations of modern state concepts in our country. Now, with this report, that a specific time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action, end quote, for states to fulfill fully established and operational within 5 years, failing which they recommend that Jamaica should withdraw from the trade and the economic elements of CARICOM. Mr. Speaker, I think this, while the resolution presented by the Prime Minister adjusts, we need to examine the foundations of such an approach more closely. It may be that it is the intention of the members of the Commission in stating this 5-year absolute deadline, intended as a negotiating ploy, as an opening gambit, so to speak. Presumably the intent with which Jamaica views the CARICOM situation, that real action is taken. So chat has come to an end. Take it around any longer. At the same time, this is not to say that tough negotiations, so believe that Jamaica has more than enough leverage. Its views firmly, courageously. We are the single largest market in CARICOM sufficiently. Comes at the end of good faith. You need to just implement, do what you're going to do. Stick to the 5 years, and we need to be realistic. The report has been with the government for more than a year. 1 year of the 5, 20% of the time has elapsed. Not to mention that we were promised committee of the House would be given a chance to consider the report. But then there was the committee has not been reappointed for reasons to do with political maneuver, I suspect. No, not you, him. That governmental decisions are often cumbersome. Who are the lawyers around here? Administers not only the law of man, but ecclesiastical law as well. And so if we are ourselves cumbersome, I could appeal to the, but she nods affirmatively. Yes. The fact is that we have to recognize that intergovernmental operations are apparatus are often cumbersome. So simply to set a deadline unilaterally is not likely to evoke the kind of compliance from partners. It ought not to be our intention to throw it down on a take it or leave it basis.
Members, time for speaking has expired. House Leader.
Mr. Speaker,
Those against? Ayes have it. Mr. Phillips.
To Mike, I think we need CARICOM colleagues to take this report of our commitment to the institution and the process. I think we need to face the fact that of our nose to spite our face. That globalization has fundamental of our existence in the international economy. States in the Caribbean more vulnerable. Comprise highly indebted states, among the most highly indebted globally and among the most. Beyond that, facing particularly intense turbulent system. For example, are still unclear. They will require a renegotiation of our access to United States and China and others, and Canada, Mexico, the EU, world economy. Energy markets are being, oil and gas supplies are not only of uncertain price. Mr. Speaker, CARICOM becomes even more important to our future. We need to make it work, not threaten to leave. That the Golding Report become the template to provide fundamental direction to a review of the CARICOM institutional mechanisms to be undertaken by a CARICOM. We support specific timelines being established, not only for the preparation of this report, but for the implementation of specific elements to be identified. Of CARICOM, we think that the entire Parliament an decisive influence on the outcome of such a process. Require exemplary leadership. It will require skill, determination, commitment. And I think in that regard, I would want to urge the government to consider and reconsider in light of its assumption of this leadership role in CARICOM. If you are to lead or subscribe to the principles of the organization, and CARICOM is essentially an aggregation of small states. And small states have particular interests. Prevalence of the rule of international law, because that's all we can rely on. We have no armies, we have no size economic leverage. All we can rely on is the rule of international law, which says that might does not make right. And we must depend on the, and I dare say, the defender of these international legal principles. So a vote on the status of Jerusalem, Mr. Speaker, is not simply a matter of embassy, not when the United Nations, by virtue of its Security Council resolution for the settlement of the larger Israel-Palestine question, we cannot undercut. Equally and closer to home, I think the time has come. If we are urging a more substantial role for the CCJ in its original jurisdiction, if we want to lead the elaboration of this network of CARICOM institutions Ought we not collectively to show leadership as far as completing the establishment of the CCJ in its appellate jurisdiction? Mr. Speaker, we think that this report, as we have said, represents a serious, much more work needs to be done. We have to make the transition now from it being a Jamaican report, so to speak, to it providing the signposts, the guidelines, the guiding light, if you will, and our regionalists. We claim our identity proudly as Jamaicans, but we also claim it as Caribbean people fixed in this region of other people in this Caribbean region, bounded by this Caribbean Sea. We contemplate an expansion, as is contemplated by the report, of CARICOM. We contemplate also other associations. We were neighbors in the Caribbean, or Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican. With the countries in Central America, we have more people talking, perhaps the largest single population which talks Jamaican, outside of Jamaica and outside of North America. And I mean talking Jamaican. Yes. And Colombia too. Yes. Just as an aside, I once encountered a gentleman in Panama. No, in Panama City. And he said to me, when last I go to St. Elizabeth? So I said, this man must have went home. He said, I have never been to Jamaica, but he sounded like he was from Junction, Mr. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't expect nor do we pursue political union. But we are unapologetic about the fact that we are stronger together when we combine our energies with our brothers. And it is a collective challenge that history has now bequeathed to us that we into, Mr. Speaker.
Mrs. Malahou-Fort.
May it please you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker.
She's not distracted.
And I begin by saying that I stand in a moment of anticipation and expectation in a manner. Starting first with this Parliament and with Mr. Speaker, I am a proud Caribbean national. And, you know, being regionalist is not limited to that side of the House. Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, in February of this year, the report of the Commission to review Jamaica's relations with the Caribbean Community and CARIFORUM frameworks was tabled in this Honourable House. The Commission was mandated to review the effects of Jamaica's participation in CARICOM and analyze whether CARICOM has met the goals and objectives of the revised Treaty of Position indicated that there was an undue focus on the CSME, but I think it is because of that mandate, Ramos. As the Prime Minister pointed out, the report presents 33 recommendations which have been framework of CARICOM. And it has its sovereign authority and regional policies and decisions from the European Union, which operates under the principally defined areas to a regional authority. Together, it is recognized by and enforceable in the courts of each member state, and where questions of interpretation arise, those are finally determined by the European Court of Justice. In contrast, Mr. Speaker, no part of their authority is left at the regional table of their deliberation. I think, Mr. Speaker, it is important in order for us to ask, and meaningful does not, in many respects, appear to correspond with the demonstrable success. Growth in its output has been anemic, and too many of its people remain poor, jobless, and hopeless. Jamaica is more than a microcosm of that underachievement. Many of us are inclined to blame it on our failed marriage because we were led to believe that integration would have been good for us and would have created. But something, as the executive in reality, be expected to work because it has not yet been functionally established. So much time has elapsed, and so much that should have been done has not been done, actually integrated, and we're having difficulty sustaining calls for a firm but calibrated response, but no effective means of enforcing them. A body that has become not aligned for a failure. It is therefore understandable why definitive commitment by all member states to a requirements for the CSME to be fully. The Commission identifies and implements under the revised Treaty of Chagaramas, and the decisions. In light of this, Mr. Speaker, compliance of the treaty, but are impeded in their role. Caribbean community, which I presently chair, states, and is responsible for providing the organs and bodies of organization of laws of the community and other legal important role in facilitating compliance, and member states and the community are compatible. And speaks to, because unless we digest it, we will not respect of the CSME prerequisites, which remain so vexed. Seamless economic space requires a sophisticated infrastructure of each other and separated at their to the northern coast of Brazil, where we have Guyana and Suriname, but a fleeting illusion to be pursued, but never enable it to work. Mr. Speakers are set, and the timelines come and go, and the actions, continued investment makes sense, and what else needs to be done. Professor Norman Gervin, that I accomplished in 2 phases over the periods 2016. Best expectation taken. It is said that it must be acknowledged that the Minister spoke to many of the provisions vital to the creation, and it is what is often referred to as CARICOM implementation. The ability of CARICOM nationals to move freely throughout the community has remained in this regard in respect of free movement of people without work permits. Other CARICOM nationals are entitled, and Grenada to date recognizes all separate skill certificate in the country where they seek employment, which is totally irrelevant to one's level of competence, is required before a skill certificate. Independents of certified workers are not allowed indefinite leave, indefinite work permits, a precarious basis on which contingent rights to ensure non-discriminatory access to social services by dependents is not yet in place. It is noted in Barbados, as the public report has stated, from the Immigration Department, as well as a letter from the school principal. While the CARICOM Agreement on Social Security ensures portability for government schemes, serve as an impediment to the free movement of CARICOM nationals that should have been done, not yet done. In respecting harmonization of laws and regulations governing the registration and operation is worth pursuing, or whether we are simply. The report also notes it's not only for tourism, but also hassle-free. That is to say, with every decision, Mr. Speaker underscores that the freedom to CARICOM National last meeting on April 13th of this year, and the committee considered whether the refusal of entry of CARICOM nationals and whether the priority treatment. It was in 2007 that's upon arrival, in order to enhance their entry and prevent can be achieved. It will significantly, it is so important. That is why it's also important, clearly and unequivocally, and the dispute settlement mechanism before I take my seat. Beyond its original jurisdiction, to which Jamaica recognized that, there is yet to be some action. The Caribbean Court is an application of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas on the development of the CARICOM single market and collective responsibility for decisions made by, for example, the court's guidance in pensions, following a more narrow interpretation, undertaking the relevant consultations in private sectors and across administrative procedures, your right as service providers and establishment owners to implement decisions and corporate entity on their behalf. Treaty already gives natural and legal purpose. The intended party would have to demonstrate such a person directly. Entitled to espouse the claim has omitted or the interests of justice require that the person is provided for in the treaty and the process by issue. The reasons for settlement of disputes for Jamaica are inconclusive. Sanctions to member states found to the resolution of the governance dilemma through amendment of the treaty among both heads and their advisors within a time frame include the formulation, Mr. Speaker, in considering the recommendation without the requisite political will. In our caucus consultations to determine once and for all where we are going, but which have not been effectively utilized thus far. Effect decisions taken by bodies and organ measures to ensure Article 20, 242 provisions of organs of the community into domestic law.
Today is so important that we exercise.
Sis Malawuford.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Grateful, Mr. In the recommendations, said that this Golding report provides a good template and proposed, I believe that it is a suggestion that is worthy of consideration. Dex issues on which the and CARICOM nationals have been frustrated in the process. You would note granting member states who sit on organ, and in this case, member states are only allowed to vote on CS 27-2, a member state the opportunity to influence the vote. So, Mr. Speaker, just high mandated to do and don't do it, still have a say. And at the end of the day, there is so much. But I invite all members to look worthy of pursuit, that there are serious problems. Regionalism is still worthy of pursuit. Then we can't sit back and look at how, on assuming a position that time has come for us, once and for all. But once and for all member states have national priorities that has come, Mr. Speaker, for action. Action.
Back in the 1990s, there was a great song called On How all of us in the Caribbean. And Rudder was very clear that in a divided world, it would appear that they don't need to say that little keys can open mighty doors. And so, Mr. Speaker, I rise today to make my contribution to the heard by the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding, the abilities of the report. In March 2017, when the Commission submitted its report to Cabinet, it debated in what appears to me to be somewhat of a deliberate haste than this Parliament. The people of Jamaica and certainly the region deserve a mediocre approach to our foreign policy deliberations seem to be our modus operandi. May I respectfully urge the Prime Minister to change this reality. Concluded in 2010 that a review of the CARICOM Treaty was necessary and mandated that an intergovernmental, what has actually happened globally over the last 8 years. The world economy has since recovered from what to exit the European Union, and our major trading partner in the North has unilaterally changed established objectives of a single market and single. Do we stay in CARICOM or Jexit? 2, if we are to stay, do we participate politically? I found the report instructive and comprehensive, and I read that team. In my own deliberations, I went and sat with Mr. Bruce Golding, who made it very clear for ensuring that the organs of CARICOM actually work. They need to strengthen entire intra-regional trade arrangements within the structure. Mr. Speaker, the report is hinged on the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas of 2001. And as it states, and I quote, Jamaica should pull out of the economic arrangement, direction and thrust that the Commission report takes. It is my view that Jamaica should never leave. The time to stay together is common history, similar cultures. Most of our economies are largely dependent on tourism. We're also all empathize. Most importantly, though, Mr. Speaker, in a global and smaller countries with smaller economies, with small populations, are better off standing economies to protect us when they're more concerned with staving off imminent trade wars and impose accident that the United Kingdom is seeking engagement of the Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean for trade. But there are some glaring realities we must confront for our own economic survival and growth. Because best interest and the free movement of our labor. And that remains something that is of concern, I think, to 12 countries in CARICOM. Jamaica's regional trade as a percentage of our total exports is the lowest. Principal benefit would come from the free movement of labor within the region. Regrettably, the region that government should concentrate on what they know best, namely creating policy and for all our goods and services to compete, while aggressively reorienting export policy. We have fragmented agencies and groups within the same, given different mandates in the context of today's realities. Neither should we continue to manufacture everything under the sun. We must manufacture those items for which we have internet than being known as manufacturing samples in everything. Until we reorient our own economy to be competitive, it is inconceivable to acknowledge that right here in Jamaica, if we want to ship or travel to our closest Caribbean neighbors of Cuba, a market of over 30 million people whose per capita income on products they consume are more aligned, creates natural opportunities to service these markets, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, let us stop laying blame and giving ultimatums, Mr. Speaker. Let's lead, especially for agricultural produce and their value-added products, so that my farmer in Southeast can. Mr. Speaker, I believe our future, and while simultaneously strengthening our resolve at home, these two are not mutually exclusive goals. We must not use populist faces, Mr. Prime Minister. Like it or not, Jamaica needs a restructured. So let us work on a new togetherness rather than walk backward into the future alone. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, sure. The manufacturing sector, fisheries, Speaker, practically the entire goods producing sector of the economy. I rise to support the resolution now being debated. It is necessary to revisit, Mr. Speaker, the rationale. Among the objectives of the revised treaty are improved standard of living. It is clear, therefore, for collective wealth and well-being through sustained economic growth derived from continuous increase in production and productivity. Sometimes a lack of commitment and an unease of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas to increase the existing provisions of the revised treaty, if applied, fairly economic development in the region through increased production and productivity gains. Therefore, we need rules and strengthen where necessary to achieve the goal of a single market. The goal of a single economy is noble, but more challenging, and will that even Europe, that has been at this for a much longer period, Chaguaramas is a comprehensive document addressing a range of issues. Based on my portfolio responsibilities, I'll restrict myself to the issues related to trade in agriculture and manufactured goods. Mr. Speaker, one of the prosperity of all participants through of the economic and social fabric of most CARICOM states, Mr. Speaker, as the single market. Support the Commission's recommendation that calls for SPS measures in a number of agricultural goods, including chicken. Expansion in our productive capacity of these goods, Jamaica sees CARICOM as a natural extension. We not only have the capacity to do so, but we must therefore accelerate every effort to have the ended by the Commission report. Mr. Speaker, it is inexplicable how quickly we move to establish SPS protocols between third countries and the CARICOM, while our request to member states for access languish. Challenges we experience in getting Jamaican patties into Trinidad, Barbados, and Belize. Juxtapose this against the volume of goods entering Jamaica from those markets. Jamaica alone in CARICOM, apart from the processing of oil in Trinidad, is overwhelmingly agro-based. In fact, our collective manufacturing capacity far exceeds the current agricultural output to supply raw materials. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this mismatch should provide the perfect impetus to spur growth in agriculture. Again, the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, through the provisions of the Common External Tariff and the Rules of Origin provisions, are intended to foster primary. This is precisely why the trade in wholly produced primary goods and sets thresholds to ensure value addition and substantial transformation. Let me say that again. Substantial transformation or value added. Liberal use of extra regional raw materials with little value addition to produce manufactured goods in the region and then ship them to the Jamaican market. All of this is happening when Jamaica itself has the capacity to produce some of these very raw materials, including peanuts, by the way. Mr. Speaker, I therefore call on CARICOM through the cated how fragmented and difficult it appears to be able to apply. The rules need to recognize this with adequate tariff protection and by lifting the threshold for transformation. For instance, Mr. Speaker, it is an affront to the peanut can simply put a pretty package on extra-regional peanuts and sell it to our market as a product of community origin duty-free. That's happening now. Rather than simply importing extra-regional milk, doing a little fortification, and then sell it into our market. Mr. Speaker, for the CSM to be effective and sustainable, it has to promote production and trade, such as standardization, fair competition, consumer protection, rights of establishment legislation, and institutional frameworks to promote investment, production, and trade. In this regard, Jamaica will continue to work with regional organizations to ensure that the issues are well ventilated and that we will implement where protocols and timelines fulfilling the objective of creating a CARICOM single market and economy that is fostering economic development and prosperity for all our people. We have the Ministry of Industry, Commerce, Agriculture and Fisheries. We believe, however, that the existing treaty, if properly applied, can move us closer to a single market. We must have the courage to apply the provisions laid out in the treaty for monitoring and enforcement. We must also muster the political will to make changes where necessary, including those recommended by the Commission report, to promote the goal of a real and true single market. This must transcend mere political talk, and in that regard, I salute the definitive timelines articulated by the Golden Report. Time is not on our side. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Mr. Bontin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start my presentation by associating myself with the earlier speakers in congratulating the Commission for the body of work. I think they've done a service. And I have to recognize that one of the members is my older brother, who has always, and he says he supports all parties. He has voted for everyone. But I think it's a firm India. I think that's a truly non-aligned family. No, and I would say much to the disappointment of my father, of my late father. However, let me say, I think we have a good basis, and I don't want to repeat much of what has been said, focused on up to now. And let me start by saying that it's not often that myself and the member from Northeast Manchester agree, but a lot of what he said there in terms of the rules of origin and those issues, I have no problem with supporting and agreeing that we need close enforcement for the single market and economy to work. I also must say I am sympathetic to the paragraph in the exercise, but something cannot be said to have failed unless it has been tried. The single market and economy that we so often declare is not working cannot in reality be expected to work because it has not yet been functionally established. And therefore that leads, I understand, it emphasizes the importance of having a clear and definitive commitment to establish the single market with a specific time-bound, measurable, and verifiable program of action. We don't go so far as to support 4, which speaks to a specific period of 3 to 5 years, which in a sense, but implementation deficit that the report speaks to is in a sense not unique to CARICOM. It perhaps is more representative of public sectors right across the region. So much more important that we focus on recommendation 24, CARICOM nationals and corporate entities to avail themselves of the dispute settlement processes in their own right,
rather than having to go through to take deliberate and strategic steps to engage the private sector at both national and regional levels, as the success of the CSME in particular ultimately depends on the private sector's involvement and efforts. And I think any process, I think, would be very useful and bring on board skills, short supply, implementation skills, project implementation skills, which are typically in short supply in the public sector. I want to just look a little bit on the recommendations related to CARICOM impact and 19, I believe, where the report calls for a review of impacts. Now, impacts is the implementing agency for crime and security. And having had some experience at CONSLE, the Council on National Security and Law Enforcement, there are some real challenges in getting a sort of standard established, just because of the wide variation and professionalism in the various security forces. Some of the smaller countries don't even have an army, and therefore trying to conduct their interface with capacity to do things like polygraph testing, etc. About how to establish some standards in terms of the shared. Has it been so difficult to real issues that we have to confront is that even within countries, and I think the integration fatigue from time to time. I do recall the experience of speaking with a colleague. There was a divide in CARICOM rather than CARICOM. And, comments were made that, boy, in terms of economic opportunity, UNASUR represents a much bigger potential block for them. Interestingly, UNASUR is having its own challenges. Now, I think this year something like 6 members have suspended their membership. But the value for the small players shipping goods to a relatively large market like Jamaica. But in services, and especially when we talk about the free movement of persons, a lot of that could reverse, and the advantages shift to the larger countries. So these things can balance out. But unfortunately, we seem to want to cherry pick the parts that suit us. For example, if we are a smaller country, you want to choose the free market. But in terms of the free movement, you want to opt out of that. And that is why I think we have not seen a total embrace. And I can speak to this not just as a politician, as a business person, where over 10 or 15 years, we have had modest operations in the Eastern Caribbean. And the challenge there is not even so much the private sector and the nationals welcoming, but more so the public servants who seem to want to only allow the minimum, to do the minimum that they can to say they're in compliance. And I'll just give you one example. In the 2004 region, we opened a branch in Trinidad. And there had just been an agreement to abolish work permits for graduates of UWI. And we wanted to send one single Jamaican to that branch, which was overwhelmingly employing nationals. But even though a work permit was no longer required, the work permit exemption took longer than it used to take to get the work permit. So it really sort of made no sense. We thought we were moving forward, but in reality, the bureaucracy just frustrated the intention, which was to make that a fairly seamless and easy transfer of staff from one to the other. So I support the Section 7 of the resolution, which speaks of giving greater prominence to the role of the private sector in supporting the CSM objectives. I think that is a good thing, and I hope it can
push things along. So I just want to close by saying that in trying to manage our place in a changing world, Jamaica needs some allies. CARICOM countries, by history and by culture, are perhaps our natural allies. As a group, we can band together around our shared values and principles, not just our individual interests, and defend the idea that there is more to politics than the rituals of domination and submission which we see playing out in international politics today.
Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like to begin, in fact, by joining my colleagues in congratulating the Prime Minister and the Chairman of the committee and the task force that was established to review CARICOM, the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding. I make the point of congratulating the Prime Minister because in my 30-odd years in this House, it's the first opportunity I believe we've had to take a deep and careful look at the provisions of the Treaty of Chaguaramas and indeed to examine in any fulsome way the political and economic construct that have guided the process of CARICOM over the years. And so I think that this is a great moment, in fact, for us because the House is participating in not just an analysis, but in also attempting to chart and create a new architecture into the future. I'm excited about that, Mr. Speaker, especially because I believe that the eminent group that met and deliberated and made recommendations were very well suited, very well appointed, and I think that they have created a body of information and ideas around which we can wrap our heads to look to the future to create this new architecture that we all want. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that because I am the Minister of Tourism, I know it is expected that I will speak to the critical subject because in discussing CARICOM and its future, we tend to look at the things that didn't work. And so we've been beating heavily, in fact, all afternoon on the things that didn't work. And what is it that worked? And is there anything that can work? And I think in time we have looked at the beginning with integration issues relating to the political process through federation. It didn't work. We've established a wonderful institution called the University of the West Indies. It worked greatly until it didn't work. Cricket has worked beautifully for a number of years until today we cry when we hear about West Indies cricket. It didn't work. And the culture of the region, we sought to bind ourselves around it, and we established CARIFESTA. And it went on for a season or two, and it didn't work. The urgent development challenges. And regionalism has been a strong and well-established and viable framework for promoting integration and cooperation in trade and other areas, and to enhance the region's competitiveness, deepen its integration into global economy, and address major social economic problems such as poverty and unemployment. A large market, Mr. Speaker, created by integration can promote economies of scale, sharing of economic costs and benefits, knowledge and skill transfer, and the pooling of resources to meet common goals effectively. Mr. Speaker, the search continues as we aim to find an economic nucleus through which integration can be ultimately achieved. And, Mr. Speaker, I think this brings tourism to the fore. Mr. Speaker, whether at the individual country level or collectively as a Caribbean, the economic contribution of tourism in the Caribbean is undeniable. Caribbean is a region of awesome peculiarities and features, which present both opportunities and constraints to its sustainable development, essentially within the context of globalization. Just to say that we are the most tourism-dependent region on earth. Just to say that of the 13 of us in CARICOM, 12 of us have tourism dependence of 10% and more. And in the case of a few of us, like Antigua and Barbuda, the dependence is 74.5%, second only to the Maldives that has a dependence of 79%. But the broader Caribbean, as we look at it, where 28 of us are in the archipelago, 16 of us have this high level of dependence on tourism. So it is fair to say, Mr. Speaker, that the common thread in economic terms that runs through the Caribbean is tourism. And therefore it forms the basis on which we can congeal around a series of policies and action to homogenize and to harmonize and to create areas of collaboration that we can work together and build a common space that can be attractive to the world and bring more than the 30 million visitors who come last year and spent $29 billion. And so I believe that in the report that former Prime Minister Golding presented, I think recommendation 33 spoke about the removal of travel tax, and I think it spoke to a general releasing of the constraints for movement within the Caribbean area. And it also presupposed that that movement would create a level of dynamism in terms of intra-Caribbean movement, tourism. The effect of which would be to give great support to the international marketing efforts that we make by reducing to a large extent the dependence on external markets, because there is a very active flow of tourism activity between the islands of the Caribbean. In fact, in the case of Jamaica, the Caribbean represents the fourth largest market for us. So the fourth largest market is the Caribbean for us. So it speaks to the point that there's a lot of energy there that we can drive on. But Mr. Speaker, it calls for an ambition, a type of ambition that will drive a new architecture relating to how do we deal with borders and the free movement of people. And the essence of all of what tourism is the free movement of people. It speaks also to how do we look at policy alignment with multiple experiences and a marketing arrangement that will allow for multi-destination tourism. And multi-destination tourism means that the small islands can now be able to compete on a platform with the larger, because the essence is that we'll be able to bring traffic into the Caribbean space and then disperse that traffic throughout the Caribbean. But, Mr. Speaker, it also requires something else. It requires for us to recognize that the insularity that has characterized us over the years has to go. It means also that we have to look at ourselves not as little islands anymore, but as a Caribbean market. And as a Caribbean market, we have 33 million people. And we can broaden our appreciation of the geography by not confining ourselves to the Anglophone Caribbean, but also to look at the Francophone and the Spanish Caribbean and to look at a broader space. And even those countries that are being washed by the sea of the Great Caribbean Sea. So, Mr. Speaker, this is an opportunity, I believe, for CARICOM to take another look at how it treats with tourism from the point of view of the demand that tourism brings into the Caribbean space for a level of supplies of goods and services which hitherto we are not able to deal with. For a destination which is highly tourism dependent and which ranks among the top 13 of the countries of the world in terms of that dependence, it is a horrible understanding that we are among the poorest, that we all are heavily debt-ridden, and we have high unemployment rate, and we also have issues with safety and security. So what then makes this tourism that is the mega industry of the world, which is the fastest growing in the world, 10% of global GDP, employ 12% of the world's employed persons, 33% in services in trade, and next to finance is the second largest contributor to global GDP. What makes that industry, with all that power, is causing poverty to be in a region where it has the highest dependence. The simple fact is, Mr. Speaker, that we have not built out the capacity to supply on the demand of tourism. And so what we wish that this new configuration that we hope to emerge from the Treaty of Chaguaramas and the understanding of a new CARICOM is to build out a new ambition to drive from this great tourism the real wealth that it has and to have that wealth remain in the Caribbean. And so, in looking at how we produce goods, we need to, as I have often said, change the consumption and production patterns in the Caribbean. We need to produce more of the agricultural needs. We need to produce more of the manufactured goods. And we need to also own the experiences that the visitors consume when they get here. That ambition, Mr. Speaker, will drive the new wealth of the Caribbean. And it will enable us afterwards to see economic growth and the dream of transformation from poverty to prosperity. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, a comrade for 30 years. A comrade for 30 years.
Mr. Hilton. Mr. Speaker, I am privileged in many ways to be participating in this debate concerning the future of Jamaica's relations within the CARICOM and CARIFORUM framework. Mr. Speaker, this cornerstone relationship holds the promise of enabling Jamaica to realize its potential of becoming a global logistics hub and the fourth node in the global trading system. However, the most recent past has raised concerns about CARICOM's benefit to Jamaica's social and economic development and its continued role in the region. Jamaica's performance in CARICOM at this stage can only be described as an underachievement, notwithstanding its tremendous promise and expectation. So the question is, Mr. Speaker, for other reasons, I believe I am correct in saying that from this honourable House, I remain the only current member who have had an active role in shaping Jamaica's relations in CARICOM and CARIFORUM over the last 25 years. As such, Mr. Speaker, I have a particular responsibility to share my views on this critical question of Jamaica's continuing role in CARICOM and to express my views. I'm very pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister has late but indeed has presented the resolution, and although I will not speak to the resolution precisely because it was just moved today and presented today, I am pleased that it seeks to mobilize to voting on the resolution. We may want to have a few comments on it before resolution. Mr. Speaker, permit me a general observation before speaking on the specific findings and recommendations. This comment, Mr. Speaker, is born of my years of experience in negotiating the several intergovernmental trade arrangements in which Jamaica has been a participant over these last 25 years. It is simply this: words matter. Mr. Speaker, no more so than when dealing with sovereign states. Particularly unhelpful, what has been interpreted by some as a not-so-subtle threat or ultimatum to our CARICOM partners that unless a specific time-bound, measurable and verifiable action program to make the CARICOM single market and economy 5 years, Jamaica should withdraw from CARICOM. There is, Mr. Speaker, a fine line between robust language designed to overcome inertia and the not-so-subtle threat of taking your mind. This is especially so in the context of our regional experience, in the failed federal experiment, and the now famous quote that 1 from 10 leaves 0. And I accept the point that we're talking about the CSM and not CARICOM as a whole. For reasons that I will more fully explain in this presentation, I am of the view that the ultimate recommendation in this report. But, Mr. Speaker, because, Mr. Speaker, I do want to commend the Commission and its leadership, its membership, by the former Prime Minister Bruce Golding for the excellent work done in carrying out its wide-ranging consultations and for the thoroughness of its research and analysis, the insights it has shared with the stakeholders, and the boldness, if not correctness, of its recommendations, of which there are 33 such recommendations. While I do not agree with some of the recommendations made as more than fully as both timely and useful, and a useful reference source for helping to shape the positions of the several actors, including the government of Jamaica, in this continuing experiment that is the CARICOM and CARIFORUM arrangements. Of the various speakers, it is not my intention to comment on all important time. I will confine my comments to a select few, especially those highlighting the crucial role of the Caribbean Court of Justice, the CCJ, in solving or at least attenuating the key problem diagnosed by the report as the main factor undermining the effectiveness of CARICOM, which is the implementation deficit. I first want to speak to recommendation 25, which addresses whether domestic subsidies provided by a member state through the supply of energy are in violation of the CARICOM Treaty. Mr. Speaker, this matter be pursued in the CCJ as a matter of urgency. I have proper functioning of the CSME, which is designed to deliver benefits to its member states on a fair and equitable basis. You may recall, Mr. Speaker, that as the then Minister of Mining and Energy, I brought this issue squarely to the fore in what I then argued for as Jamaica's energy dividend
for a mental task force then negotiating the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, and in particular the CSME arrangement, I considered that it was a fair price for Jamaica to access its for a fair price for Jamaica to provide access to its market, the largest in the Caribbean, capital investments and energy. For Mr. Speaker, I said then, and I'm still of the view, that energy is as critical to production as water is to life. After all, Mr. Speaker, the entire objective of the CSME was to create a platform for efficient production and competitive cross-border trading in an expanded market as a means. The key elements of the CSME are, of course, the free movement of the factors of production, namely goods and services, labor and capital, with the creation of a customs union established through the harmonized system of tariffs and secured by a common external tariff, the CET. I remain firm of the view that access to CARICOM energy resources on other than national treatment terms, as provided for in Articles 7 and 8 of the regional rights and obligations, as well as benefits and burdens. More than that, Mr. Speaker, it would secure for those member states endowed with energy resources a structural advantage in the trading arrangements within the single market and economy, and render those countries, like Jamaica, which has no established reserve to date, at a structural disadvantage. Based on this view of the treaty, Mr. Speaker, the then Deputy Solicitor General, Professor Stephen Vassiani, and I were to file an action on behalf of the Government of Jamaica on the basis that the issue of cross-border trading of energy resources and its byproducts fell within the terms of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. More specifically, Mr. Speaker, that the pricing of energy resources and energy products that discriminates against CARICOM nationals on the basis of nationality only is prohibited by the treaty. Importantly, Mr. Speaker, the then General Counsel of CARICOM, now a member of the CCJ, Justice Winston Anderson, after reviewing the submissions from both government corporations or individuals, should be charged at the same rates as Trinidadians for the same or like products. Mr. Speaker, whether LNG or liquefied natural gas was the same or like product as natural gas was left to be decided by the CCJ, which was not yet established. The issue, Mr. Speaker, and the specific issue, this issue, Mr. Speaker, and the specific issue of subsidized energy as an input into manufacturing recommended by the report, if a proper functioning of the CSME. These issues are critical, and they're made all the more urgent due to the reported large countries within CARICOM will have a structural advantage in the cross-border trade in goods and services than the energy-poor ones. The question then is, what is the role for the CCJ in meeting the implementation challenges? As just indicated, Mr. Speaker, the issues of energy subsidies and the discriminatory pricing of energy and energy products within CARICOM remain major issues warranting the CCJ's determination. Yet the question must be asked. The question is pertinent, Mr. Speaker, because it is a fact that no member government of CARICOM has ever filed an action or claim against another member state, notwithstanding the several issues arising in the implementation or lack thereof, in the absence of member governments initiating action. Invoking the original jurisdiction of the CCJ, CARICOM nationals, both corporate and individual, have sought and utilized to good effects the limited private right of action enshrined in the treaty. In the process, the CCJ has had the opportunity to demonstrate its considerable sophistication, expertise, and erudition in delivering a quality of justice that has brought it commendation and helped to build confidence and trust in the institution. So that in the landmark case of Shanique Marion versus the Barbados government, a matter of which I have had more than a passing acquaintance, the CCJ demonstrated boldness of action and courage in ordering the government of Barbados to change its immigration practices and procedures, zealously guarded by states as a symbol of their sovereignty. On the way to its decision, the court made path-breaking rulings. Heads of government decisions taken at its conferences are binding on member states and must be implemented by a court that is clear as to the central objective of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas and confident in its interpretation and application of international norms that can withstand scrutiny from commentators, legal luminaries, and judges in other well-regarded courts, both regionally and internationally. The question remains, Mr. Speaker, in light of the increased initiated an action against another member government before the court in order to address the well-known implementation deficit. Or advisory opinion on a matter of treaty interpretation or application in the process of implementing the CSME, not even to seek guidance from the court where difficulties and challenges have arisen. They have simply done nothing. Mr. Speaker, if this reality speaks to the lack of political will on the part of member governments, even to seek guidance from the court, what is the excuse for private businesses and individuals whose interests are being directly and adversely has a critical role in assisting with the implementation of the CCJ, in aiding in the implementation process, and thereby overemphasizes the role for the intergovernmental task forces in negotiating parts of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas without first, listen up, Madam Director, Solicitor General, Attorney General, without first having the court's interpretation of member states' balance of rights and obligations, as well as benefits and burdens under the existing revised Treaty of Chaguaramas. Mr. Speaker, commenting briefly on Recommendation 23, I would urge caution in seeking to, quote, restructure the existing dispute settlement arrangements by establishing a central dispute settlement body similar to that which exists in the WTO. I agree with it. First off, such as uniformity of decision-making and laws. By giving the CCJ exclusive and compulsory jurisdiction concerning disputes among contracting parties with the community organs, community nationals who are given special leave, and referrals of issues concerning the revised treaty from national courts. Also, Mr. Speaker, at this stage of the development of a new species of law called community law, it was thought important to give primacy to the precedential value of decisions made by the CCJ, rather than by arbitration in similar disputes. Are applied prospectively, and therefore limits the scope of remedies available to the tribunal. In contrast, the CCJ can and have granted injunctive relief, pecuniary damages, and awarded costs to the successful parties, and thus enforce the treaty provisions. Regarding Recommendation 24, I will simply add to my comments on number 23 that the limited private as to ground jurisdiction in cases brought before it by private companies and individuals once there is clear evidence that the rights granted by the treaty has been infringed. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I return to recommendation number 33, this time to make my substantive comments. The point is already made in this presentation, but bears repeating that the simultaneous use of the court alongside the Intergovernmental Task Force for negotiating reforms of the treaty is perhaps the most practical and balanced to the advisory and/or declaratory functions of the CCJ. The proposal that key structural issues of governance, accountability, as well as key issues influencing the establishment of the single market and economy are not likely to happen, if at all, unless resort is had to the advisory and declaratory functions of the CCJ. The proposal that key structural issues of governance, accountability, as well as key issues influencing the single market and economy are not likely to happen overnight, if at all. Indeed, the 5-year period for some issues to be addressed, as have been said by the Leader of Opposition and others, seems arbitrary and is just too short a time based on past experiences. Therefore, shorter time, 5 years, is arbitrary. Therefore, it is highly likely, without the chance of broad-based and meaningful change occurring. From the treaty, which I've seen the Prime Minister has attenuated, and assumes a position similar to the Bahamas. The Bahamas' position in CARICOM. And only then, Mr. Speaker, consider alternative trade arrangement with CARICOM. First point to note, Mr. Speaker, is that Jamaica and the Bahamas are similar in some ways, as the Minister of Tourism pointed out, but are quite different in other ways. They are both tourism countries, relying heavily on the Bahamas lacks an industry and therefore produces very little of what the population consumes. The benefit of a CET to the Bahamas, single market arrangement, because it saw no real benefit in the common external tariff, only disadvantages. Mr. Speaker, should Jamaica withdraw from the CSME, it would probably lose its status within the Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA, or at least be sidelined, which is aimed, let me repeat, Prime Minister, you need to listen very carefully, which is aimed at deepening regional integration among CARIFORUM states, which is the CARICOM plus the Dominican Republic and Cuba. All that would be available to Jamaica. All that would be available to Jamaica would be the general system of preferences, the GSP scheme, which is non-contractual, meaning that there is no binding agreement and is merely offered by developed countries on a bilateral basis. The conditions surrounding GSP schemes are therefore subject to change unilaterally. This is not a basis on which investors make their long-term capital investment, Mr. Speaker. Expanded market access in CARIFORUM, EPA, Cuba, and countries in South and Central America, certainly not a reduced and reducing market access. But, Mr. Speaker, a Jexit for CARICOM would learn the same minimum. Jamaica would forfeit its payment to the CCJ and may well have to continue paying fees to some organizations or organs in CARICOM. And I would suggest that a word to the wise. The simple fact, Mr. Speaker, is that the Jamaican market is not attractive enough, either in CARICOM or standing alone. Neither do we have the capacity to undertake several bilateral or multilateral agreements simultaneously or serially. Mr. Speaker, if we were not attractive to the Canadians within CARICOM, why would Canada, for example, negotiate with Jamaica alone. Why? The lesson, Mr. Speaker, that may help, that may be an incentive. The lesson, Mr. Speaker, is it is always better to expand market access from a position of greater market access and not from a shrinking market access. It has often been said that while CARICOM is in the world and in the logistics-centered economy that we aspire to, ever-increasing market access is needed, not less. Mr. Speaker, Jamaica should commit to continuing to provide the leadership within CARICOM. And if we want to attract more investors into the designated special economic zones, or SEZs, to be implemented, only through properly negotiated and enforced agreements can we assure our investors, local and foreign, of increasing market access, not through generalized systems of preferences, which are non-contractual. Mr. Speaker, let us start to enforce our treaty rights under the existing CARICOM-CARIFORUM arrangements, and we'll see Jamaica and the CARICOM thrive. Thank you.
Dr. Tufton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Being the night watchman, Mr. Speaker, there are shots that can be displayed at this point in time. All is left for me to do, therefore, for the most part anyway, is to endorse what has been said and be brief about it, Mr. Speaker, in anticipation of lights declaring the end of the session this evening. Bad light, of course. Mr. Speaker, I want to begin by commending the administration of the day, and in particular the leadership of the Honorable Prime Minister, for having the vision and the foresight to advance. And Mr. Speaker, I think it's important, and I want to make the point because I have listened, and I believe the discussion on both sides have been quite constructive, and I think the approach, the attitude, and there's a lot of sincerity in seeing CARICOM work for us as a country, work for us as a region, and I want to commend all involved. But for a very long time, there has been this perception, and I had to confront it when I sat in the upper house. On that side, a political entity in the country had an affinity to, an emotional attachment to, a commitment to the regional collaboration, cooperation, and integration movement. And periodically, even in the discussion here, Mr. Speaker, tonight, I have heard insinuations, if not explicitly, implicit suggestion that commitment remains only in certain quarters and not in others. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, on this side, that this requirement or request by the Honorable Prime Minister is a demonstration of the commitment on this side to working with our Caribbean partners and CARICOM in particular. And I want to place that on the record in reinforcing our own commitment and debunking that perception that existed for a long time that we are not pro-region and pro-supportive of the critical mandate of the region. Mr. Speaker, I endorse what has been said about the as an entity. The reality is that we have challenges, we have opportunities that are similar in nature by virtue of where we are, geographic space, and the challenges that we face mentioned. Mr. Speaker, and the statistics associated with that to determine whether or not CARICOM has served us well, and Jamaica in particular. And the common discussion around ourselves versus a Trinidad as a major trading partner, and the deficits that exist between us, the trade gaps in their favor. Very often, though, Mr. Speaker, and the report speaks to this, and I think it's worthy of repetition, the extent to which CARICOM plays an important role as it relates to people exchange. And from Jamaica's perspective, the very conservative estimate is that we have well over 30 to 40,000 Jamaicans who are deployed. I think Trinidad alone has close to 20,000 who are deployed in the CARICOM space in respective territories, islands, who are playing significantly important roles, both in a professional capacity, skilled and unskilled, and indeed bringing significant benefits to those jurisdictions, and by extension providing an opportunity for them and for their dependents here in Jamaica. And if we were to assess not just the tangibles, but the intangibles in terms of services, I believe the perspective, the importance of CARICOM to Jamaica would be greatly amplified. And I think that is one of the areas I think that the report allows us an opportunity to examine and to emphasize, and hopefully will renew our commitment to expanding the relationships that we have, despite the challenges. Oftentimes, we identify the individual isolated cases as cases that we need to address, but oftentimes in highlighting those cases, we overlook the many others who benefit by the exchange of professional effort or unskilled effort within the region. Mr. Speaker, the challenge we face, and again, it has been mentioned by several of the speakers, I say it only for emphasis, is the extent to which we state noble objectives, noble commitments, and we have a deficit in terms of the implementation. And I believe almost every speaker who that spoke before me mentioned the implementation deficit. And I think the report addresses that and provides an important basis on which we should recommit ourselves, but recommit ourselves in a manner that assesses periodically through monitoring and evaluation our deliverables and align those deliverables to the commitment that we made. And I think in that respect, there's a lot of value from the report in supporting a more rules-based arrangement in getting things done, not just talking about them, but getting it done. And again, on both sides, we have emphasized that. But I want to, in that context, mention what I consider to be a possible challenge that we face within CARICOM. And that is our motivation, based on the current arrangement, the current structure, to almost attempt to be all things to all men. In other words, the agenda of CARICOM and the role that it plays and the role that is required of it by member states, and I assume by those, sometimes waters down the effectiveness of CARICOM to work as a team, in that it becomes extremely difficult for decisions to be made around a common cause, and those decisions to manifest themselves in implementable initiatives. In other words, Mr. Speaker, in my own view, I've always felt that CARICOM has to redefine its role and truly spend time and effort in assessing the areas of emphasis and focus that truly brings benefit to all, and therefore improve the chances of getting a commitment from all member states towards achieving and implementing those benefits. Now, I've identified a few that I think are impatient of debate. The areas of education and training. Clearly, we have a history there with the University of the West Indies, with extended education, offshore education institutions, a big area that no one within the region can debate or argue over in terms of whether or not it doesn't benefit each member state. In the area of regional security, We are right in the middle, Mr. Speaker, of countries that supply, practice illicit trade in narcotics or guns, and countries that supply, that demand. And we have gotten caught right in the middle, Mr. Speaker, and as a consequence, it has been a serious risk. There is common purpose in us working together as a team to address those issues. The risks from natural disasters, Mr. Speaker, international lobbying, a very important area. We are, in our own right, a sovereign state, and therefore in the international arena, we are entitled to vote and to influence international agenda. Together as a group, if we agree on those causes, we could carry significant weight in a number of areas. In the area of healthcare, Mr. Speaker, my particular portfolio where I want to spend a little time, the challenge of health begs collaboration within the region. And in a sense, we are confronted by very similar challenges. And the solution becomes that much more difficult if we attempt to confront these challenges as individual member states as opposed to a collaborative effort by the group. And I want to just mention one or two specific examples in supporting the report and the main thrust of the report to strengthen that collaboration through establishing particular rules, monitoring, and evaluation. Mr. Speaker, in the area of communicable diseases, the biggest threat that we face clearly is the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti in particular. And that vector has wreaked havoc on the people of the Caribbean. And Jamaica's experience, my colleague across from me, who was Minister of Health, well, both colleagues, appreciates, I think, more than anybody else, the extent to which that challenge has been a significant challenge for us as a population. Now, let's take ZIKV as a case in point. ZIKV is named after the Zika forest in Africa. That's where that particular disease started. It is said that the mosquito, the Aedes aegypti, interacted with monkeys in the desert, in the forest of Africa, the Zika forest. ZIKV was created, and it has traveled from there through the Caribbean, and once it touched down in one island, manifestations of that. And I could use several other such other examples to demonstrate those vulnerabilities. It therefore, Mr. Speaker, requires of us, if we are to confront this challenge and challenges of this sort, a collaborative effort. Now, CARICOM makes provisions for that through CARFA, through other agencies, and indeed here in Jamaica, because we are one of the larger islands, we have gone ahead and done even more through the establishment of the Mosquito Research and Control Unit in collaboration with the University of the West Indies, in collaboration with CARFA, in collaboration with bilateral agencies like the USAID, and are now embarked, Mr. Speaker, on a group effort, a collaborative effort to tackle a problem which represents a risk to all of us. Mr. Speaker, there is no clearer indication, certainly from a public health perspective, that we need that collaborative effort in order to deal with the risks that we are exposed to, certainly in public health. If you look at the health profile of the region, Mr. Speaker, obesity levels are perhaps some of the highest levels in the world, this region, and the impact of obesity on NCDs. Mr. Speaker, our profile is similar, our lifestyle is similar, the environment is similar, and as a consequence, we are similarly exposed and at risk in these cases. Therefore, it requires, Mr. Speaker, a regional areas of opportunities in public health. And I want to touch on a subject that my colleague, newly minted Minister of Agriculture, is particularly excited about from an investment perspective, and that is marijuana or ganja. Mr. Speaker, in the international arena, marijuana, meaning at the level of WHO, is classified as a type A narcotic, meaning it's seen as a illegal substance. And as a consequence, Mr. Speaker, some of the opportunities that we in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, with the advantages that we have with the cultural practices that provide some of these opportunities, the recognition globally in terms of our rules of origin and so on, cannot be exploited unless we take advantage of a regional approach in this particular international product. And I am happy to say that in this regard, the CARICOM Ministers of Health have taken a decision and have advanced a position in the halls of the WHO to get marijuana reclassified from a type A narcotic to a raw material input to support medicinal solutions for the population and for the world. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, indeed, since that presentation was made last year, a few months ago, we were contacted by the WHO, the World Health Organization's expert committee, the committee that considers these recommendations or submissions, that this particular issue is now being taken up by them and will be placed under active consideration, which, Mr. Speaker, means we have pioneered an approach to get what is a natural advantage in public health to be mainstreamed. And, Mr. Speaker, Jamaica alone would have had a chance, but Jamaica, with all the other Caribbean territories, seeing similar benefits, has a much greater chance to achieve this particular objective. Another one, Mr. Speaker, quickly, in public health, and this is linked now to human resource capacity. We benefit from each other through the exchange of HR capacity. But at the same time, we are at risk to the rest of the world in particular areas of human resource capacity. And in public health, that risk is perhaps greatest, in that we lose, in particular, our healthcare professionals, our specialist nurses, to the international marketplace, in particular North America, whether Canada or the US and the UK. And this has been an ongoing problem. Mr. Speaker, we took this challenge, Jamaica, supported by its Caribbean colleagues, to the WHO again, and made a very strong case to highlight the nature of the problem, the international practices which runs contrary to ILO rules, not enforceable rules, but rules of conduct as it relates to international recruitment of professionals, where shortages exist and where it places the country that you're recruiting from under undue hardships. We took that case to the international community and got a well-received listening ear from the WHO, to the extent where a communique was issued around this particular issue. We did better than that. We advanced an approach towards bilateral cooperation, where the typically recruiting country would support the country losing that human resource capacity to advance additional training. And you would have heard in the sectoral presentation where we have been successful at doing that. The Caribbean region, again, Mr. Speaker, was critical to that, in that while one country may have advanced it, from a public health perspective, there are significant advantages to sharpening up and strengthening the regional approach and regional collaboration in support of mutual benefits. But that focus, as I said earlier, has to be sharper. Mr. Speaker, I certainly support the report's and collaboration between the private sector, the University of the West Indies, and other stakeholders. In public health, you cannot do it on your own. You have to collaborate, you have to establish partnerships, not just in country, but between countries, not just in region, but between regions. But you are stronger as a team when you work together. And again, we have seen significant examples of that. Importantly, though, I think a common thread that has emanated the discussions here tonight is the issue around the implementation deficit. And so, to my mind, one of the stronger recommendations in the report, which I certainly endorse, is the recommendation for performance criteria to be established with 3-year assessment to support accountability of commitments that are made. And the speakers all spoke to that, Mr. Speaker. It is something that I certainly endorse. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, as the second to last night watchman, and I'm setting the example for the other night watchman to come, since I've been only here at 5 minutes, I want to say that this report, and I want to commend former Prime Minister Golden and the team, the Honourable Prime Minister, for advancing, those who accepted and have done the work. This report places on the agenda an important subject. It renews and advances a commitment to a cause. And we shouldn't get carried away with that final recommendation about withdrawal, because, you know, when you have options, options range from one extreme to the next. It doesn't mean that you're going to exercise every single option that is there. And that was never the intent of the report that was submitted. The report gave options for consideration. And I'm here to say, certainly from a public health perspective, the report is timely, the report was necessary, and the report certainly shows leadership on the part of the administration to advance a discussion which hopefully will lead to a better region. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Guy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak on the resolution which deals with the report of the Commission to review Jamaica's relations within CARICOM and CARIFORM framework as presented to the government in March 2017 and laid in Parliament this year. In April 2017, speaking then as opposition spokesman on foreign affairs and foreign trade, Mr. Speaker, I questioned the delay in the tabling of this report in the Parliament. Today, we are now having this very important debate. Again, as I did last year, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the chairman and his team for putting together this report worthy of discussions, introspection, and more importantly, of proposed actions, though not necessarily agreeing with all its recommendations. Firstly, I want to say, Mr. Speaker, I support CARICOM and its stated intention based on the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas in 2001, with all its intent in having a Caribbean single market and economy. Whilst it is recognized, Mr. Speaker, that the 15 member states of CARICOM may have their own agendas and have a tinge of insularity, there's more that binds us together as a grouping than separates us. It may be an idealistic position, Mr. Speaker, but like similar agglomeration of countries in any economic unions, they are not perfect, and indeed may be termed works in progress. However, for these unions to work to the benefit of all states, the Secretariat has to be functioning optimally. This engine room of the economic union has not been living up to its mandate. The report encapsulates this in Section 7, where it speaks to the strengthening of the powers and capacity of the Secretariat with an ability to provide member states in the implementation of CARICOM decisions and fulfillment of treaty requirements, especially in drafting, training, and it goes on. But even more poignant is the comments relating to the limited powers of the Secretariat, and that the implementation deficits are primarily due to national governments over which the Secretariat has no authority, or may, with whatever power they have not used it. Mr. Speaker, it is evident that part of the lackluster view of and indifference to CARICOM is due to the ineffectiveness of the Secretariat. People don't hear from the Secretariat. The majority of our 18 million people don't even know of the Secretariat and what it does. I suspect even CARICOM member states are asking the same question. But perhaps the year-end report, which has gained much attention primarily on, is shown in Recommendation 26, which reads, Review and procedures of foreign policy consultation and coordination in order to avoid, as far as possible, the types of conflicting and embarrassing positions that have emerged from time to time among CARICOM members, depriving it of the collective force it is capable of exerting. But no other time is that statement more profound as it is now. Become more of a motley crew when coordinated by national governments as they have defied logic as well as those intentions of reason and principle. Traditionally, CARICOM has voted in international fora such as United Nations on various issues as a bloc. CARICOM has sought to support a candidacy for international organizations as a united force, and where it is usually looked to for intention and guidance by other countries. Now take the recent Jerusalem vote, Mr. Speaker. CARICOM was all over the place. 7 voted to support the resolution, whilst 5, including Jamaica, abstained. This created widespread condemnation by citizens of many countries, including here in Jamaica. At the OS, our record as an integration union has not been encouraging. We have meandered on many important issues. This was not always so. This was not always so, Mr. Speaker. In fact, in an article by Sir Ronald Sanders in the Observer of June 4, 2017, on the OS meeting of May 31, 2017 states, and I quote, contrary to all who the Caribbean community displayed strong solidarity at the OS on Wednesday, May 31, 2017. In doing so, the CARICOM countries show the soft power that they can wield in hemispheric stage where they maintain solidarity and unity of purpose. It was a moment, he quoted, of unbridled CARICOM pride. This demonstrates what is capable of being achieved when we are united in our approach. A quote from an article in the Inter-American Dialogue of June 19, 2017 states, the structure of the OS voting system gives Caribbean countries significant power. Thanks to the one country, one vote, the OS is one of the few venues where these small countries, especially in the Eastern Caribbean, can play a decisive role on the world stage. The Caribbean smartly recognize their power is strongest when they act as a unit, which will make it hard to peel off individual countries, unquote. However, Mr. Speaker, that position was preceded by another position taken at the Permanent Council of the OS in April 27, when incidentally, the vote for convening the May meeting was taken. Quoting from an Observer article of April 29, 2017, when headlines screamed, Caribbean countries divided on situation in Venezuela. And it says, Caribbean countries appear divided on the need to discuss the ongoing political situation in Venezuela, even as the Permanent Council of the OS approved a resolution to convene a meeting of ministers of foreign affairs of the region to consider the situation in that country. The vote was evenly split among CARICOM member states, 5 for and 5 against. Again, Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, in June 6, 2018, this very month, our position was just as divisive. Quoting from a Caribbean publication, Caribbean community countries were split yesterday when the OS voted to pass a resolution that can initiate the process of Venezuela's suspension from the organization. The General Assembly voted with 19 member states in favor, including us, 4 against. 4 against, including Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Belize, Grenada, Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, Suriname, and Trinidad among 11 abstaining. This, Mr. Speaker, this non-unified approach took a turn for showing what you were wearing when a public spat erupted in the media between two heads of government on the matter of Venezuela and the position of the OAS. I need not elaborate on that, but this just demonstrates and supports the recommendation highlighted in the CARICOM report. Went on further, Mr. Speaker. It states the capacity of member states to negotiate globally is strengthened by their membership in CARICOM as a regional bloc. CARICOM constitutes 14 votes in important international and regional bodies such as the UN, 7%, the Commonwealth, 27%, ILO, 7%, OAS, 40%, and it went on. This gives CARICOM states, when acting in concert, a leverage proportionately good. This has been particularly effective on divided issues where CARICOM 14 votes are earnestly sought by other countries. And it also went on to suggest that the banking de-risking challenge will be far more effective than battling separately. But we live in a world, Mr. Speaker, where national objectives can flavor foreign policy decisions. Countries are seduced by offers of bilateral aid, a phenomenon known as dollar diplomacy, but which in the report was colorfully described as eat-a-food diplomacy. Countries can be threatened by others, subtly or even more overtly, and this is where some member states run for cover instead of circling the wagons. Many of our member states have and are practicing eat-a-food diplomacy, and unfortunately, this has resulted in the approach CARICOM has taken in recent times in relation to its fragmented foreign engagements. What all of this demonstrates, Mr. Speaker, is that as a united force, whilst we might not be invincible, we can wield some amount of power. Our respective governments will have to come to the table to be more prepared to decide that expediency will not pay in the long run. Finally, Mr. Speaker, CARICOM has an important role on the states in the Caribbean. It cannot afford to fail. Were that to happen, History Report, Time for Action Report was presented in 1992. Not much was done in terms of its recommendations. We have another report before us. As Sir Shidras Rampal sadly said, and the Declaration of Granance, and through innumerable pious declarations, affirmations, and commitments, the road is staggering and shameful, unquote. This report, Mr. Speaker, will it also share a similar fate?
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank members for their participation in the debate. I've heard the comments of members, and I can say that members feel truly fulfilled in having the opportunity to make their contribution, make their start. Indeed, could change the trajectory of a regional organization. Mr. Speaker, let me respond to a few issues raised report to Parliament. Just for the record, received the report and deputed the IRTC, the International Relations and Trade Committee of Cabinet to review it. That took some time. In fact, the Ministry of and other ministries, and of course the Attorney General, not to mention the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, had various comments. It took some time for the cabinet to, and what we would not accept. Once that was done, then we laid it on for members of the House to, as a group, and I thought that it would be the appropriate time just before going into the taking over the chairmanship and hosting the heads here at the Caspi. So, Mr. Speaker, what it does is to take advantage of the currency of the issue. It is now on the minds of all Jamaicans that next month we will be hosting all the heads of CARICOM here. And so there is the momentum and the attention to the issue. Having said that, it is not an academic abstract. You know, Mr. Speaker, CARICOM means it relevant. We could lose not mean anything to us. And that, to me, Mr. Speaker, is the greatest fear. If we, at this level, do not act to make the institutions relevant in your constituency, when you get a farmer or you go to the hotel in your constituency, and they say to you, it makes no sense. When I leave to go to Trinidad and I can't get in, or I leave to go to Barbados and I'm sent back to the region, it's not accepted. Then no matter what we say in here, if the people lose faith in the institutions, that's it. I got the sense that the Jamaican people were losing faith and interest in the regional institutions, including inviting the Prime Minister of Trinidad and putting the commission together to deliver this report to us today. Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us asks us to resolve on 10 items. The first, cooperation within CARICOM remains relevant. All the persons who have participated and contributed, and indeed the Senate remain. Mr. Speaker, the second point on which the resolution asks us to resolve is that it is essential for CARICOM to focus primarily on the view of the fact that issues related to sovereignty and supranationality continue to play a part in impeding progress towards a single economy. The report, Mr. Speaker, suggests that Jamaica should withdraw from the CSME if we cannot secure a commitment that is measurable, specific, and time-bounded. The Cabinet debated that and agonized over that, and I see the same debate in the House as well, as to whether or not we should withdraw from the CSME. Some people interpret that as withdrawing from CARICOM. Let me just out of an abundance of clarity say that there is no consideration of withdrawing from CARICOM. Carefully, Mr. Speaker. CARICOM is more than a market. That works very well. But let's make it work now. Let's make it work again. We have cooperation in disaster management, SEDIMA, which, Mr. Speaker, now more than ever, the region needs to cooperate on this matter. The Minister of Health pointed out the cooperation in health, standards, we have cooperation in tourism, and a number of, and in sports. You can't are, as bad as things are, we won. We beat Sri Lanka. So, people in Jamaica how similar we are to the rest of the people in CARICOM. That if you went to Grenada and you traveled through the hills like you are in any of the parishes in Jamaica, it isn't so far from the Jamaican accent. Not to mention, of course, and Marlene would fit in very well in Guyana. And so would you. But what I'm saying is, Mr. Speaker, is that Jamaica cannot separate itself from the common culture, history, heritage, and indeed our common colonial legacy. So similar in terms of our aspirations. We have things that join us together that don't really depend on politics and institutions. So there is no contemplation of Jamaica separating itself. But there is a construct, Mr. Speaker, economics. People want things that we have. We have to create institute bodies of water and which makes markets work well. So connectivity is an issue. So our markets will always face this disadvantage. It's always been not contemplated in this report, but it's of importance, is how do we invest in the infrastructure to bring our markets closer together for seamless transportation and connectivity. But because we are sovereign states, local markets, so every government would want to, protect their farmers, protect their industries, increase in our capacity to that country, the region. As is the conversation I had with President Moore, which is about 20 times the size of Jamaica, would make and farm. But that was the thinking behind the creation of the market, that Trinidad with oil, Jamaica would produce manufactured goods, and Guyana would do agriculture, and then with what the economists call the focus on the comparative advantages that you have, then you would create natural markets that would work. But the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that's not what has happened. Everybody is trying to protect their own market. So even though we have a common external tariff agreement, the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that even within that, everyone still is trying to issues local producers here. For example, the minister will tell you, and patties going into, where was it, Trinidad?
Trinidad.
So,
and recently Belize.
And recently Belize, as you mentioned. So it's how do we make the single market issue of a single economy, common market, and then a single economy. Single economy builds on top of a common market. Because now you want to talk about fiscal policy for capital movement. How do we get all of those?
Mr. Speaker, the time being 7:33, beyond the time having passed 7:30, I ask that the House be allowed to sit beyond 7:30 to enable the Prime Minister to come.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Prime Minister may proceed.
Thank you for the reminder. I will be very economical with time. So Mr. Speaker, the single economy poses even greater challenges to coordinate and to get done within the time specified by the report produced by former Prime Minister Golding. It would be almost an impossibility now to seek to harmonize economic policy as it relates to, for example, monetary policy within the region or fiscal policy. So we wouldn't want to contemplate that. So what the government has to get commitments from the various heads for the market, which are things that we can do within the 5 years to deal with the issues of the common external tariff. We can deal with, we can get the free movement of labor. We can get agreement on services. Those are things we can get within the 5 years, and those will improve the economy. So the strategy of the government, Mr. Speaker, is not to pull out of the market, defend it, and seek to ensure that it is effective and improve it. But, Mr. Speaker, we don't think it is realistic, especially at this time, to pursue a single economy. So I want that to be clearly understood. Right. Right. So we are. So the well, it's an important distinction to be made by virtue of what is written in the report. So I'm happy that it is not an issue on that side. So, Mr. Speaker. So our intention is stated as in 3. All member states must make a clear and definitive, a specific time-bound, measurable and verifiable program of action to fulfill all obligations. Now, Mr. Speaker, we agree that there is an implementation deficit. And it would appear to be not just for CARICOM, but it may be a general. We talk a lot, we pontificate a lot, we are good conceptualizers, but when it comes to actually getting things done, I can't tell you, Mr. Speaker, it is as if we have a fear of getting things done. It is as if, I don't know what it is. It is as if we don't have a stack of things done properly, and therefore nothing should get done. So, Mr. Speaker, the proposal to get things implemented, we accept. We accept that implementation, Mr. Speaker, must be something that we insist upon. And I will use whatever influence is accorded to the chairman of the conference to get members to commit to implementing. It makes no sense that we agree and there is no implementation. Mr. Speaker, I want to go to point number 7 in our resolution, where I think we all agree that greater prominence should be assigned to the role of the private sector, but I want to amend it. It's not just the private sector. We need to give greater prominence to the role of our unions. We have to give greater prominence to the role of civil society and NGOs in supporting the objectives of monitoring the compliance and implementation of the states, the member states of CARICOM. So, Mr. Speaker, I think we agree on that point. Mr. Speaker, point number 8, Jamaica shall require a review of the basis of assessment of the member states' financial contribution to CARICOM and regional institutions, as well as a rationalization of existing bodies. I think that is an important point, that at the meeting of the heads, Jamaica will call for a review of the basis of assessment of our contributions. We will also call for a review of the system, more developed and less developed. So I want to have an explicit agreement in the House, Mr. Speaker, that this is something that Jamaica should do. Mr. Speaker, CARICOM should seek to broaden, this is point 9 now, its economic cooperation with trade agreements with third parties, Dominican Republic and Cuba, Caribbean. We can advance our negotiating mechanism while the truth believe
process that you unless there is that separate trade arrangement. So the fact that you may have a discussion with Britain, with CARIFORUM, is not the same as.
Remember, this is just for I mean, I accept your point. The common market, and decided to come out, then it would negotiate it with similar status as let's say the Bahamas, let's say Dominican Republic, let's say Cuba. So it wouldn't, in any way, Jamaica, we should all note that countries all over the place. Belize, for example, Suriname, right? Suriname is in what's the name of that one? UNASUR. Cannot pursue. They are pursuing even deeper integration than the other member states. The regional trade deals with the Dominican Republic, with Cuba, who are right beside us. Yes, I see you want to go home now. Towards advancing the CSM are not implemented by all member states within the agreed time. The nature depends on threats. But I don't want this statement to be. Our own interest is to see CARICOM work. There's no question about that. It's have other countries, other member states to respect that pathway, come on board, because a report should be placed with heads. So, Mr. Speaker, without much more debate, I commend the House.
And then I put the whole resolution.
Prime Minister amendments to the support that the partners with CARICOM and within the CARIFORUM framework, and recommends that it be used by CARICOM to guide a reform, then be further resolved, as the Prime Minister has indicated, those points 1 to 10, with the amendment. And yeah, at 7 there is an amendment, and at 4 there is an amendment where the 3 is deleted. In other words, a period of 5 years. Yeah, the word 3 too. And with that, we.
Prime Minister, you put the amendments.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for raising the first amendment. I did not, and I'm putting that as the amendment to the resolution in terms of adding the, but it was read already by. So remember, we're jointly debating the resolution. So,
well, you can put the resolution.
So, Mr. Speaker, I'm placing the.
Put the amendment. Those in favor? Those in favor? Those opposed? The amendment approved, the resolution approved.
From the Senate be recommitted.
Those in favor? Those against? Yes, I will. Bills brought from the Senate.
And
the following. Oh, sorry, excuse me. The following is a message from the President of the Senate to the Honorable House of Representatives. I have the honor to advise the Honorable House of Representatives of Government to be known as the major organization for which they have the honor to advise the Honorable House of Representatives that on the 15th day of June 2018, the amendments for which the Honorable Senate desires the concurrence.
Dr. Chuck.
Major Organized Crime and Anti-Corruption Agency Act 2018 be considered and approved at a later date. Be considered.
Favor? Those in favor? Those against? As of it.
The bill shortly entitled the Public Procurement Amendment Act 2018 be considered and approved at a later.
Those against, as of it. Mr. Semudo.
Any further business today? I think it is fair to say that this has been a historic day and a day that reflects a unity of purpose for which we are at this time on a very, very timely basis. And I wish to congratulate the Leader of the Opposition for the support and the 26th next week. We will be suspending the sitting, Mr. Speaker, until, you know, it turned on to the next Tuesday, 26th, when we will hear from the Honourable Minister.
The President and the training for Parliament, if they are unable to attend. Please, reservation is made for members. 2 on the morning before the House meets. Marriott, 1 Park Avenue, Kingston. Same time. On Tuesday the 26th and on Wednesday, the press will be watching us. And this is an important matter. This is a journal.
Keep we island, don't do it. Keep we island clean, so clean. From the don't do it.
No dash no paper, no dash no plastic. Dispose your garbage responsibly. No know how to recycle, learn it quick, and if you drop it, better pick up every piece of it. Plastic